a single father, a hidden past, and one night that would force him to choose between the life he built and the lives of everyone around him. What happens when the most dangerous man in the room is wearing a chauffeur's uniform? If this story grips you from the first word, hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and follow along, because you do not want to miss what comes next. Check. And now, on a Tuesday morning in a gleaming Manhattan lobby that smelled like money and fresh flowers, he was doing it again, pushing a mop across Italian marble while 30-foot glass walls let the October sun bleed gold across everything it touched. He was wearing a gray uniform 2 sizes too large. His name tag said Mike. It was a good job. He kept telling himself that as he walked back through the side entrance of the Grandview Continental, one of those towering 5-star hotels that seemed designed specifically to make ordinary people feel like guests in someone else's life. Marble floors, chandeliers so large they looked like small planets, a lobby that smelled like money and fresh flowers and something else underneath, something deliberately chosen by a consultant, probably. Warmth, possibility, arrival. Logan had worked there for 14 months. He knew the valet schedule, the names of the overnight security staff, the way the kitchen staff argued near the service elevator on busy nights. He knew the job, and the job knew him, and that was enough. He wasn't supposed to be remarkable. It was a Thursday in October, which meant the city had gone gray and cold 2 weeks ahead of schedule, the kind of premature autumn that makes people feel vaguely cheated. Logan had picked up a double shift because Ethan's school had a field trip on Friday that cost $40 Logan didn't currently have, and there was no complicated calculation to make. You work the extra shift. You get the $40. Your kid goes to the museum with his class and doesn't have to explain to anyone why he stayed behind. Ethan was 8 years old, small for his age, and the kind of kid who asked questions that took about 30 seconds longer to answer than you expected. Not because he was slow, because he wasn't. He wanted the actual answer, not the version adults handed kids to make them go away. Not in the sentimental greeting card way, in the grinding, physical way of a man who had reorganized his entire existence around one small person and found himself, on most days, doing math in his head. 6 more hours, then I pick her up. 4 more hours. 2. He'd been undercover at Sterling Tower for 11 days. The assignment had come through a former colleague, a man named Reeves, who now worked for a private intelligence contractor that Mason refused to name even in his own internal monologue, out of a habit of operational security that had outlasted his service by years. Reeves had called him on a Thursday evening while Mason was helping Lily with a second-grade worksheet about fractions, and he'd said, "I know you're out. I know you said you were done. Just hear me out." Mason had almost hung up. He hadn't, because Reeves was one of maybe 4 people in the world he actually trusted, and because something in Reeves's voice, a flatness, a controlled tension, had told him this wasn't a casual ask. The intelligence was specific, a credible threat against the CEO of Hayes Capital Group, a woman named Evelyn Hayes, 30 years old, one of the youngest chief executives in the financial sector, and the kind of person whose face appeared on the covers of magazines that Mason never read but occasionally saw in dentist waiting rooms. The threat originated from a network with ties to at least 2 foreign intelligence services and 1 private criminal organization that Reeves described, with characteristic understatement, as motivated. The target wasn't robbery, it wasn't ransom. Whatever they wanted from Evelyn Hayes, they were willing to use violence to get it, and the threat assessment put the window of action inside the next 2 to 3 weeks. "Why me?" Mason had asked. "Because you're the only person I know who can get close enough to do this without anybody noticing," Reeves said. "And because she's already got a security detail, and whoever's behind this has clearly got eyes on the official channels. I'm not putting Lily at risk. That's why it has to be undercover. Nobody's going to look twice at the janitor." Mason had sat with that for a long moment. In the background, Lily was asking if 5/8 was bigger than 1/2, and his silence was making her nervous. "Daddy, is it?" "Yeah, baby, 5/8 is bigger." He'd called Reeves back in the morning with a yes. The building's security operation was, on paper, competent. 6-man rotating detail on the executive floors, 2 plainclothes in the lobby, keycard access at every choke point, cameras on all public-facing corridors. The lead security officer was a former Secret Service agent named Kowalski, who carried himself with the slightly aggressive confidence of a man who'd once stood in rooms where history happened and hadn't quite adjusted to the reduced scale of his current posting. Mason had assessed all of it in the first 3 days. The gaps were predictable, not because the security team was bad, they weren't, but because no fixed security arrangement could account for everything. The cameras on the B2 level had a rotation cycle of 14 seconds with a 4-second blind spot near the southeast stairwell. The plainclothes agents in the lobby changed their positioning on the hour, predictably, which meant anyone watching the lobby for 40 minutes could map their pattern. The freight elevator used by maintenance staff bypassed the security checkpoint on floors 3 through 12. None of this information was something Mason had gone looking for. It was just what happened when you trained your brain to observe a space the way his brain had been trained. You couldn't turn it off. You saw the seams in things. He'd filed all of it in a daily report to Reeves and gone back to mopping floors. Evelyn Hayes arrived at Sterling Tower every morning between 7:52 and 8:06, depending on traffic from her apartment on the Upper West Side. She took the private elevator to the 38th floor, where Hayes Capital Group occupied 3 full floors of premium office space. She left the building between 7:15 and 8:30 in the evening, again depending on whatever fire she was putting out that day. Mason had observed her for 11 days. She was not what he'd expected, though he'd long since learned to distrust his own expectations. The magazine covers had given him a version of her, composed, polished, the careful performance of a woman who'd spent years fighting to be taken seriously in rooms that hadn't wanted to take her seriously. In person, she was something more complicated. She moved fast and carried herself with the slightly forward lean of someone always running slightly late, and she had a habit of pausing in the lobby to answer emails on her phone while her 2-person escort stood nearby looking professionally impatient. She drank too much coffee. He'd counted, because he counted things. And she had a tension headache she was trying to manage with ibuprofens. She kept in the front pocket of her bag, which she took twice before noon on the days when the markets were bad. She didn't notice him. Nobody noticed him. He didn't take it personally. He'd stopped taking it personally a long time ago. It was a Tuesday, the 12th day, when everything accelerated. Mason was working the main lobby, running his cart past the reception desk toward the eastern cluster of seating near the elevator bank, when the sensation hit him. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was a shift in the room's temperature, a change in the quality of the attention around him, the way a space can feel different when the people in it are operating under a different set of intentions than the space was designed for. He'd felt it before. In a market outside Mosul, in a narrow street in Aden, in a hotel corridor in a city he wasn't supposed to have been in. He kept moving. He adjusted the angle of his mop bucket so the reflection in its surface gave him a partial view of the revolving door. 2 men had come through in the last 4 minutes, separately, positioned near opposite columns, both wearing the kind of unremarkable business casual that people wore when they wanted to look like they belonged somewhere. Neither had gone to the reception desk. Neither was looking at his phone. Their eyes moved in the specific, systematic way of people scanning a space rather than inhabiting it. A third man had positioned himself near the coffee kiosk to Mason's left, facing the elevator bank. He counted, assessed, did it in the time it took to push the mop 5 feet. 3 visible. Probably a 4th he couldn't see yet. He moved his cart toward the service alcove near the east stairwell, kept his head down, and reached into the maintenance bag clipped to the side of the cart. His own weapon, a compact SIG P365 that Reeves had arranged for him under a maintenance contractor's equipment manifest, was locked in a case in a maintenance closet on the 3rd floor. 90 seconds away by service stairs, minimum. He didn't have 90 seconds. He could see it in the body language of the man near the coffee kiosk, a barely perceptible shift toward the revolving door, a repositioning of weight. They were moving into final placement. Whatever the trigger was, it was close. Then the revolving door turned, and Evelyn Hayes walked in. She was 7 minutes earlier than her average. Her assistant was talking to her, and she was half listening while she scrolled through something on her phone, and her 2-man escort was 6 feet behind her instead of their usual flanking positions because the revolving door only allowed single-file entry. And in those 6 feet of separation, Mason watched the room change. The man at the coffee kiosk straightened. The two men near the columns began moving. And a fourth figure, Mason had been right about the fourth, stepped out from behind one of the structural pillars in the lobby's center, cutting off the line of retreat toward the elevators. 4 men, coordinated, armed. He could tell from the way they moved, the slight pull of fabric against concealed weight at 2 o'clock on the waistband of the nearest man. Evelyn's escort reached for their earpieces. Too late. The man near the coffee kiosk was already closing distance, and his partner was angling to separate Evelyn from her team, and the other two were moving to box the whole scene in. Mason left the mop handle against the cart. He picked up the wet floor sign, yellow plastic, 4 pounds, hinged, and started walking. Gig. The first operative didn't see him coming because nobody sees the janitor. Mason crossed 12 feet of lobby floor in the time it took the man to get within arm's reach of Evelyn, and he brought the wet floor sign around in a hard arc that caught the operative across the jaw before he could process what was happening. The impact was ugly, a crack of plastic against bone, and the man went sideways into one of the lobby's low accent tables, scattering the artful arrangement of magazines that a designer had probably spent 20 minutes perfecting. Evelyn looked up from her phone. The second man, the one near the column, was already reacting, hand going to his waistband, and Mason was already moving again. He grabbed the mop bucket's wheeled cart with both hands and shoved it hard across the marble, sending 20 gallons of water and the bucket skidding into the man's legs. The operative stumbled, lost his footing on the wet floor, and Mason closed the distance before he'd finished falling, catching him with a forearm across the throat on the way down. The third man, the one from behind the pillar, had his weapon out. Not a gun, a taser, which told Mason something about the operational parameters here. They wanted Evelyn alive and functional. That was useful information that he filed away while he was already changing direction, using the toppling second man as an obstacle between himself and the taser's line of fire. The discharge hit the cart instead of him. Blue-white arc. The cart's metal frame ate the current, and the operative looked momentarily confused, which was the 2-second window Mason needed to get inside the man's reach. He caught the taser wrist, twisted it behind the man's back in a motion that his body still remembered with muscle-level clarity, and put the man face down on the marble with a controlled fall that was louder than it needed to be, but not loud enough to shatter the lobby's other illusions. The fourth operative, the one from the coffee kiosk who had started all of it, had reversed course the moment things went wrong. He'd gotten maybe 15 feet toward the revolving door when Mason's hand came down on the back of his collar. The man tried to turn and throw an elbow. Mason let the elbow come, absorbed it on his forearm, stepped inside, and used the man's own momentum to introduce his face to one of the lobby's structural columns. Not hard enough to do permanent damage, hard enough to stop the argument. The whole sequence had taken, by Mason's internal clock, somewhere between 35 and 45 seconds. The lobby was quiet in that particular way that spaces go quiet when the people in them have just watched something they don't have a category for. The receptionist had her hand over her mouth. One of the lobby's regular security guards had his hand on his radio, and a look on his face like he'd reached for the radio purely on instinct and wasn't sure what he was going to say into it. A woman in a camel-colored coat near the elevator bank had pressed herself against the wall and was gripping her laptop bag with both hands. Evelyn Hayes was standing where she'd stopped when the wet floor sign made its first contact, phone still in her hand. Her escort had recovered their positioning and had their own weapons out. Real ones, 9mm service pieces. But there was nobody left for them to point at except 4 men in various states of incapacitation on the Italian marble floor. She was looking at Mason. He was aware, in that moment, of exactly what he looked like. Gray maintenance uniform, 2 sizes too large, name tag that said Mike, mop water on his shoes. He was breathing slightly harder than he'd like. He was 35, not 25, and 45 seconds of full contact work in a marble lobby had a cost, and he could feel the developing bruise where the elbow had caught his forearm. Her eyes traveled from him to the 4 men on the floor and back again. "You're not actually with maintenance," she said. It was not a question. "No," Mason said. "Who are you?" He considered the question for a moment. He could hear sirens starting. Someone had hit a panic button somewhere, either Kowalski's team upstairs or the lobby guard with the radio. The cover was done. 11 days of carefully constructed invisibility, and it was done. Right now, he said, I'm the person who kept you from getting abducted. Her jaw tightened slightly. Not fear, exactly. Something more controlled than fear. The expression of a person who had spent years learning to manage their reaction to things that were trying to knock her sideways. And before right now? That's a longer conversation. I have time. You might not, Mason said. He was looking at the 4 men on the floor. One of them was starting to show signs of recovery. These 4 aren't the whole picture. You understand that, right? 4 guys walking into a corporate lobby with coordination like this. That's not improvised. Someone planned this. Someone who knew your schedule, knew your entry point, knew the positioning of your security detail. She stared at him. You're saying someone inside the building. I'm saying these men knew things they shouldn't have known unless someone told them. He kept his voice level. The sirens were getting closer. When the police get here, they're going to ask you a lot of questions, and your instinct is going to be to trust the people around you. I'm asking you to be careful about that instinct until you've had time to think about who actually had access to your schedule this morning. Kowalski came through the stairwell door at a near run, 2 of his team behind him, and the lobby's controlled stillness broke into the kind of organized chaos that follows an incident. Men with radios, urgent voices, the crackle of walkie-talkies, the arrival of 2 uniformed NYPD officers through the revolving door in a cold blast of October air. Mason stood where he was and let it happen around him. He'd been through enough incident responses to know the geometry of them, who moved toward the bodies, who moved toward the witnesses, who moved toward the obvious person of interest, which in this case was going to be the man in the maintenance uniform standing in the middle of 4 incapacitated men on the floor. He put his hands up before Kowalski reached him, not in surrender, in the specific posture of a man who knew how these moments worked and wanted to skip the part where someone made a mistake with an adrenaline-soaked trigger finger. I'm not a threat, Mason said to Kowalski. My name is Mason Drake. I'm working with an intelligence contractor. I can give you a verification contact. The 4 men on the floor are the threat. Kowalski looked at him, looked at the 4 men, looked at the lobby. What the hell happened in here? Someone tried to abduct Ms. Hayes, Mason said. I was in a position to stop it. You're a janitor. I was dressed like a janitor. Kowalski's eyes narrowed. Who sent you? Verification contact is a man named Reeves. He'll explain the rest. Mason kept his hands up and his voice steady. Behind Kowalski, he could see Evelyn Hayes watching the exchange with the same direct, assessing look she'd given him when she'd walked out of the lobby seating area. There was something working behind her eyes. Not just the shock of what had just happened, but a processing, a recategorization, the look of a person who was good at reading situations and was rapidly revising what she thought this one was. She was frightened. Mason could see that. She was frightened and she was holding it very tightly under a layer of composure that was impressive under the circumstances. And part of him, the part that was a father, not an operative, felt a flicker of something like empathy that he didn't have time for right now. The next 3 hours were the particular misery of official aftermath. 2 NYPD detectives, a representative from Kowalski's employer, 2 men in suits who arrived 40 minutes in and whose identification Mason recognized as belonging to a federal agency that had a memorandum of understanding with Reeves's organization. A paramedic who looked at Mason's forearm and told him nothing was broken, just bruised, and offered him an ice pack he accepted because his forearm hurt and he was 35 and not above an ice pack. Reeves arrived at the 90-minute mark. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his 50s who had the particular posture of someone who had spent decades moving through difficult situations and had decided, somewhere along the way, that the most effective response to difficulty was a kind of bone-deep calm. He spoke to the federal representatives for 12 minutes in a room Mason wasn't in, and then came out and the situation around Mason changed in the specific way that situations around operatives change when the right people make the right calls. The 4 men on the floor had been taken by ambulance, 2 in worse shape than the others, none with life-threatening injuries. Their identifications, when run, came back clean, in the way that only professional operatives' identifications came back clean, which was to say they were real names attached to real histories with gaps in them where the operational periods were. Mason sat in a conference room on the 2nd floor and ate a granola bar from the vending machine down the hall, and thought about Lily, who was in school right now in a second-grade classroom in Queens, doing fractions and probably arguing with her teacher about something, completely unaware that her father had just spent 40 seconds dismantling 4 trained operatives with a wet floor sign and a mop bucket. He needed to pick her up at 3:15. He looked at his watch. That was still 5 hours away. He could make that. Evelyn Hayes came to the conference room at the 2-hour mark. She came alone. No escort, no assistant, which told Mason something about the kind of person she was. She sat down across the table from him with a cup of coffee that she'd gotten from somewhere, and she set it down between them, and she looked at him for a moment without saying anything. She looked different than she had in the lobby. The composure was still there, but it had settled differently. The way a person settles after the adrenaline has worked its way through and left behind just the residue of what happened. There were lines around her eyes that the magazine covers had smoothed away. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been moving too fast for too long and had just been forcibly stopped. "Reeves told me some of it," she said. "Okay. You've been in the building for 11 days. 12, counting today. Watching me." "Watching the building," Mason said. "You specifically, but mostly the building." She nodded. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. "The threat assessment. How serious is it?" "The real one. Not the version your contact gave me." Mason looked at her. She wanted the honest answer, not the managed one. He could tell that about her in the way that you could tell certain things about people who'd been through something real in the last 2 hours. "Serious enough that 4 men walked into your lobby in broad daylight," he said. "That takes planning, coordination, resources, and it takes information they shouldn't have had, specific information about your schedule and your security positioning." He paused. "Today wasn't the full operation. Today was either a test or the opening move." The lines around her eyes deepened slightly. "You think they'll try again?" "I think the people who sent those 4 didn't send them expecting them to succeed," Mason said. 4 men taking a CEO out of a secured lobby against a 2-person close protection detail. That's ambitious. If I hadn't been there, they might have managed it. But the planning involved suggests whoever's behind this has resources and patience. They're not going away because this didn't work. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the conference room's interior window, Mason could see the lobby. Men in forensic vests photographing the scene, the yellow plastic of the wet floor sign on the floor where he'd dropped it, the overturned mop cart. The marble floor was still wet. "The man you mentioned," she said finally. "The one inside the building." "I said someone inside the building," Mason corrected. "I don't know who, but you believe it." 4 men knew your schedule down to the window of arrival, he said. They knew the positioning of your escort. They knew which elevator bank you'd use. Either they had extraordinary surveillance resources they deployed in the last 48 hours, or someone told them. Evelyn Hayes set down her coffee cup. Her hands, he noticed, were steadier than they had been in the lobby. "I've worked with most of my team for 3 years," she said. "Some of them for 5. "I know." "That's not—" She stopped. "You're not telling me not to trust them. I'm telling you to be careful about which of them you tell things to until you know more." He kept his voice level. "I understand how that feels. I'm not minimizing it." She looked at him directly. "Do you understand how it feels?" He thought about that. He thought about the 2 years he'd spent in operational teams, where the man next to you was the most important person in the world, and the quality of that trust was something you'd built, tested, staked your life on. He thought about what it meant to have that trust broken. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Deet. Reeves pulled Mason into a side office at the 3-hour mark. "The cover's burned," Reeves said. "I know. The operation as designed is over." "I know that too." Mason looked at him. "What's the assessment?" Reeves set a tablet on the desk between them. On it were 4 photographs. The men from the lobby, their real faces, not the cleaned-up versions on their false IDs. And 2 of them have been linked to a network operating out of Eastern Europe with reported connections to at least 1 state intelligence service. The other 2 are freelance, for-hire operatives who've worked multiple clients over the last 3 years. He paused. "Whoever contracted this has money and connections." "What's the target?" "That's what we don't know yet." Reeves picked up the tablet. "We know Hayes is involved. We know the threat is credible and it's not going away, but the why is still unclear. Hayes Capital Group has a technology arm, Mason said. She mentioned it in a board presentation I overheard last week, something about a quantum encryption project they've been funding. She was being deliberately vague about the details, even in a closed presentation. Reeves went still in the specific way he went still when information connected to something he already knew. Where did you hear that? 31st floor. I was cleaning the corridor. The meeting room has a gap under the door. Mason watched him. What do you know about it? Not enough, Reeves said, but enough to know it might be relevant. He set the tablet down. I need you to continue. Mason looked at him. The undercover element is done, Reeves said. I know that, but she trusts you now. Or she's as close to trusting you as she's going to get in the next 12 hours, which is more than anyone else on this situation has. She's going to need protection, and she's going to need someone who can work inside the threat rather than around it. I have Lily. I know. Reeves. I know, Mason. Reeves met his eyes. I'm asking, not ordering. You're not in the service anymore, but I need to tell you that based on what we know right now, the threat to Hayes is not confined to Hayes. He paused for just a beat. These people found out about you 11 days into a well-constructed cover. I don't know how. That's a problem. The room was very quiet for a moment. They know I'm involved, Mason said. They know someone was watching her. They'll figure out the rest. Reeves kept his voice carefully neutral. I've already put a 2-person security element near Lily's school, just precautionary. She doesn't know they're there, and her teacher doesn't know. But Mason, if these people are willing to walk into a corporate lobby in Midtown Manhattan in broad daylight, we have to consider every variable. Mason sat with that. He was 35 years old. He'd spent 11 years doing things that he'd believed, on his better days, were worth doing. Stopping people who would otherwise hurt other people. Collecting the kind of intelligence that kept bad things from happening in places that never made the news. Then his wife had died. 3.5 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, 4 months in which the world had become a tunnel with Lily at one end and grief at the other. And he had decided, with the clarity that sometimes came from loss, that none of the things he was good at mattered more than being there when his daughter woke up in the morning. He'd meant that. He still meant it. But he was also a man who had looked at 4 armed operatives in a lobby and seen them before they saw him, and he was sitting across from a man he trusted telling him that his daughter had a security element near her school because the people behind those 4 operatives might already know his name. There was no version of this where he could walk away and be sure Lily was safe. That was the terrible, simple math of it. Okay, he said. Okay? I'll continue. He looked at Reeves. But Lily stays protected. The 2-person element stays on her until this is over. And you keep me updated on every development in real time, not the filtered version. Understood. And Reeves. Mason stood. When this is done, I'm done. For real this time. Reeves nodded. He had the grace not to make any promises about that, which Mason respected. Mason picked Lily up at 3:17 that afternoon, 2 minutes late, which made her stand at the school gate with her backpack and a theatrical expression of abandonment that she had clearly been rehearsing. You're late, she informed him. 2 minutes. 2 minutes is late. He crouched down to her level. She had paint on her left hand, blue-green, the color of something oceanic, and a gap in her smile where she'd lost a tooth last week, and the new one was coming in at a slight angle, which she was very proud of because she said it made her look tough. I know, he said. I'm sorry. She studied him with those brown eyes. He'd learned a long time ago that she could tell when something had happened to him, some register of tension or tiredness that she read, the way other kids read picture books. She didn't ask about it. She never asked directly. She just looked at him a little longer than usual, and then she reached out and grabbed his hand with the paint-covered one, leaving a blue-green smear across his knuckles. It's okay, she said, in the magnanimous tone of a person bestowing forgiveness. I knew you were coming. He squeezed her hand and stood up, and they walked toward the subway together in the October afternoon, and for a few blocks he let himself just be present in it, the weight of her backpack bumping against his leg, her voice running through a detailed description of something that had happened at lunch involving a boy named Theo and a juice box that had ended badly for everyone. He listened to every word. He also noted the two-person security element Reeves had placed, positioned on opposite ends of the block. Neither of them looked at him. He didn't look at them. They were there, and that was what mattered. "Daddy," Lily said. "Yeah? You okay?" He looked down at her. She was watching him with that look, the one that saw through things. "Yeah, baby," he said. "I'm okay." She considered this. Then she went back to the story about Theo and the juice box, and Mason walked beside her through the fading afternoon light, already turning over what Reeves had told him, already mapping the variables, already calculating. The four men in the lobby were the beginning. He'd known that the moment he'd looked at them. The coordination had been too clean, the resources too visible for a first and only play. Whoever had ordered that operation had expected it to fail, or had expected it to reveal something in how it failed. What they hadn't expected was Mason. He intended to keep that advantage as long as he could. He thought about Evelyn Hayes in the conference room, her hands around her coffee cup, asking him if he understood how it felt to discover that someone you'd trusted was working against you. He thought about what he'd told her. "I do." He thought about the quantum encryption project she'd mentioned, the careful vagueness of it, even in a closed room full of people who worked for her. He thought about Reeves going still. There were pieces he didn't have yet. There were pieces nobody had yet. But the picture was assembling itself at the edges, the way pictures did when you knew how to look at the space between the things you could see. He had a feeling the next few days were going to be very long. He bought Lily a hot chocolate from the cart on the corner of their block, because it was cold and she'd had a good day and because some things were still simple, and simple things were worth protecting. She wrapped both hands around the cup and looked up at him with foam on her upper lip and said, "This is the best day." Mason Drake, former Navy SEAL, currently the most dangerous janitor in the history of Sterling Tower, looked at his daughter and felt something in his chest that was complicated and clear at the same time. "Yeah," he said, "it really is." The night after the lobby, Evelyn Hayes didn't sleep. She'd tried. She'd gone through the motions of it, showered, changed, poured herself 2 fingers of scotch that she'd barely touched, sat on the edge of her bed in her Upper West Side apartment, and stared at the wall across from her with the particular blankness of a person whose mind was running too fast for the body to catch up. Outside, the city made its usual noise, and the security detail that Kowalski had posted at her building's entrance made their quiet rounds, and none of it helped. At 2:17 in the morning, she got up and went to her home office and pulled up the internal calendar system for Hayes Capital Group. Her schedule that Tuesday, the arrival time, the entry point, the positioning of her escort, had been accessible to 14 people within the company. She knew this because she'd spent 40 minutes after Mason left the building going through the access logs herself. Before her assistant could do it, before Kowalski's team could do it, before anyone else could manage the information for her. 14 people. She knew all of them by name. She'd hired most of them personally. She sat looking at the list until the numbers on the screen blurred slightly, and then she closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The problem with suspicion was that once you let it in, it didn't stay contained. It spread. It got into the spaces between normal things and made them look different. She'd worked with some of these people for 5 years, and now she was sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, looking at their names on a list and trying to find the one who had handed her schedule to 4 armed men. And the whole exercise made her feel sick in a way that was different from the fear she'd felt in the lobby. The fear in the lobby had been clean, at least. Immediate. This was something slower and meaner. She thought about what Mason had said. Be careful about which of them you tell things to until you know more. She thought about his voice when he'd said it. Flat, factual, the voice of a man delivering information that he knew would land badly and wasn't going to soften for her benefit. She'd been irritated by it in the moment. She was less irritated now, at 2:17 in the morning, sitting alone in the dark with a list of 14 names and no idea which one had betrayed her. Mason spent the night going through what he knew. He did this at the kitchen table in his apartment in Queens, after Lily was asleep, with a cup of coffee he'd let go cold and a yellow legal pad he'd had in a kitchen drawer since they moved in. He didn't write things down on it, operational habit, nothing in writing, but having a physical surface in front of him helped him think in straight lines. The four men in the lobby, their profiles as Reeves had described them: two with Eastern European network connections, two freelance, the coordination of the operation, the information leak, the quantum encryption project that Evelyn had mentioned with such deliberate vagueness that it had registered in his memory even before today had given it relevance. He kept coming back to that. The vagueness. He'd worked intelligence long enough to know what careful vagueness looked like. It looked like a person who had something valuable enough that they'd learned to talk around it even in rooms they thought were safe. Evelyn Hayes had done exactly that in a closed presentation to her own board, and the specific thing she'd been careful around was a technology project being developed under a company called Quillon Systems, which was a subsidiary of Hayes Capital Group that Mason had found in the corporate filings he'd reviewed before the assignment began. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Lots of investment firms had technology arms. He thought more of it now. He called Reeves at 6:45 in the morning. "Quillon Systems," he said when Reeves picked up. A pause. "Good morning to you too. What do you know about it?" Another pause, slightly longer. "How much of this do you actually want to know right now?" "All of it," Mason said. "That was the deal." Reeves exhaled. "Quillon Systems is developing a quantum encryption algorithm. The technical details are above my pay grade, but the short version is that if it works the way the people who understand it say it works, it would make current encryption infrastructure effectively obsolete. Military communications, financial systems, intelligence networks, anything relying on existing encryption protocols would be vulnerable." He paused. "There are people in multiple governments who would very much like to have it, and people in multiple criminal organizations who would like to sell it to whoever pays most." Mason was quiet for a moment. In the hallway, he could hear Lily starting to move. The small, specific sounds of her morning routine, the thump of feet on the floor, the creak of the bathroom door. "The attack on Hayes wasn't about Hayes," he said. "Probably not just about Hayes," Reeves said. "She's the access point. Control her, you control Quillon. Control Quillon, you control the algorithm." Mason set down his coffee cup. "Who else knows about this?" "On our side. Fewer people than I'd like. The information about Quillon came to us through a secondary channel. I'm not confident the primary agencies have fully connected these dots yet." A pause. "Which is part of why I need you in the field, Mason. If the official channels get ahead of this without the right framing, it becomes a different kind of problem." "You mean a different government might get to it first?" "I mean, several of them are already trying." He told Lily he had to work a few more days on a project. She was eating cereal at the kitchen table, and she looked at him over her spoon with the expression she'd developed. He wasn't sure when, for times when she sensed he wasn't telling her the whole thing. She was 7. She'd already figured out the difference between what adults said and what they meant, which was both impressive and slightly exhausting. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. "No," he said, which was technically a lie, and they both probably knew it. She ate another spoonful. "Mrs. Garibaldi says I can stay late in her classroom if I need to, for homework club." "That's good?" "She has good snacks." A pause. "Better than the vending machine ones." He sat down across from her. "Hey." She looked up. "I'm going to pick you up every day," he said. "Okay. Whatever else happens, I'm going to be at that gate." She held his eyes for a moment with a seriousness that sometimes made him forget she was 7. Then she went back to her cereal. "I know," she said simply, like it wasn't a question she'd been asking. He watched her eat her cereal and thought about Reeves's words. "These people found out about you 11 days into a well-constructed cover," and felt the weight of it settle into his chest where it would sit until this was over. Evelyn called him at 8:30 that morning on the number Reeves had given her. "I went through the calendar access logs last night," she said. No preamble, no greeting. He respected that. "What did you find?" 14 people had access to my full schedule for Tuesday. 3 of them were external, my driver's dispatch company and a scheduling coordination firm we use for investor meetings. She paused. "The other 11 are internal. All people I know. All people I've worked with." "Did anything stand out?" One of the 11 accessed the schedule at 11:48 p.m. on Monday night. That's not necessarily abnormal. Some of my team works late. But 11:48 is later than usual for a schedule check, and it was the last access before the attack. Who? She was quiet for a beat that told him the name cost her something. Daniel Cho, my chief technology officer. Mason let that sit for a moment. How long has he worked for you? 3 years. He came from a competing firm. I recruited him personally. Another pause, tighter this time. He runs the Quillon Systems project. He's had day-to-day oversight of the algorithm's development for the last 18 months. There it was. I need you to act completely normal with him today, Mason said. Don't change your behavior. Don't avoid him. If he notices a shift in how you treat him, we lose whatever advantage we have. You're sure it's him? I'm not sure of anything yet, Mason said. A late-night schedule check is a data point, not a verdict. But I need time to build the picture, and I need him not to know someone's building it. That's going to be very difficult, she said, in a voice that was trying to be controlled and not quite succeeding. He understood that. Being asked to behave normally towards someone you suspected of setting you up for abduction was not a small ask. I know, he said. I'm sorry. A brief silence. Will you be here today? I'll be nearby, he said. You won't see me. That's... She stopped. He thought he heard something like dark humor try to surface in her voice and fail. Somehow, that's actually reassuring. He was back in the building by 10. Not as a janitor this time. Reeves had arranged a maintenance contractor's credential under a different name, Marcus Webb, service elevator technician, there to perform a routine inspection of the building's elevator mechanical systems. The uniform was different. The cart was different. The effect was the same. A man doing a job that nobody wanted to pay attention to, moving through spaces that other people moved through without seeing. The 31st floor, where Quillon Systems had its internal research office, was a restricted access zone. Key card only, no visitor entry without escort, cameras on both approaches to the corridor. Mason spent 40 minutes in the service shaft adjacent to the floor, ostensibly running diagnostic cable through the elevator equipment conduit, actually listening through the ventilation gap to the controlled white noise of an office where people were being very careful about what they said aloud. He didn't get much. Fragments. A phone call in which Daniel Cho, whose voice Mason had cataloged from 3 weeks of overheard meetings, spoke with someone he addressed only by title, something that sounded like director, in a tone that was deferential in a way that didn't match how Cho normally spoke to anyone at Hayes Capital Group. The conversation was brief and technical, most of it below the threshold of what Mason could parse through the ventilation gap, but 2 phrases reached him clearly. The timeline has moved up, and 6 seconds later, she doesn't know yet what she's actually sitting on. Mason stayed very still in the service shaft and let those 2 sentences run through him. The timeline had moved up. Whatever had been planned, whatever the lobby attack had been the opening act of, it was accelerating. And Cho's certainty that Evelyn didn't understand what she was actually sitting on suggested a level of information asymmetry that went beyond a simple leak. Cho knew something about the algorithm that Evelyn didn't. Maybe something about what it could actually do. Maybe something about who else wanted it. He filed it, pulled his cable through the conduit with the unhurried movements of a technician doing routine work, and moved on. What? The call came at 2:40 in the afternoon. Mason was in the stairwell on the 22nd floor when his phone vibrated. The number was Reeves's secondary line, which Reeves only used for things that couldn't wait. We have a problem, Reeves said. Tell me. Someone ran your identity this morning. Through a channel that suggests foreign intelligence assets, Eastern European origin, possibly the same network as 2 of the lobby operatives. A pause. They have your name. They may have your home address. The stairwell went very quiet. Mason stood with the phone against his ear and felt the particular cold that settled over him when a threat shifted from abstract to specific. Lily, he said. The 2-person element is still on the school. I've already doubled it. 4 people now. I pulled them from another assignment. They're in position as of 20 minutes ago. She's fine. She's in class. Reeves's voice was steady. But, Mason, we need to accelerate the security arrangement for her. I have a safe house in Westchester, family appropriate, 2 of my best protection people. It would mean taking her out of school for a few days. She's going to know something is wrong. Yes, Reeves said. She probably will. Mason pressed his back against the stairwell wall and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light above him had a flicker in it, barely perceptible, a 3-second cycle. And he watched it because looking at something concrete helped him think. He thought about Lily at the school gate 2 minutes late, and paint on her hand and foam from the hot chocolate on her upper lip. And I knew you were coming. I need to tell her something, he said. Not a lie. Something close enough to true that she can hold on to it. Okay? And I need to be the one to bring her there. Not your people. Me. That can be arranged, Reeves said. But quickly. If they've run your identity, the clock on your home address is hours, not days. He left the building at 3, picked Lily up at 3:15 on the dot. She came through the school gate with her backpack and her gap-toothed smile, and she looked at his face and the smile changed, not disappearing exactly, but rearranging itself into something more careful. Daddy? Hey, Bug. He crouched down. I need to tell you something, and I need you to really listen, okay? She stood very still. She was good at that, being still when things were serious. He didn't know where she'd gotten that from, whether it was his training echoing in her somehow, or just who she was. My work has a situation, he said. A complicated one. And for a few days I need you to stay somewhere safe while I finish it. How safe? Very safe. There are people I trust there. Will you be there? At night, he said. Every night. She looked at him. Is it because of the bad people? He kept his face still. What bad people? The ones you're trying to stop. She said it simply, without drama. I'm not dumb, Daddy. You've been different for 2 weeks, and yesterday you came home and your arm was bruised. She pointed at his forearm, where the sleeve of his jacket ended. He'd forgotten about the bruise. He sat down fully on his heels and looked at his daughter and felt something complicated and breaking move through him. Yeah, he said. There are people I'm trying to stop, and they're trying to make things harder by getting close to the people I care about. He kept his voice even. So I need you somewhere they can't reach you. She looked at his face for a long time. 7 years old, those brown eyes that saw through everything. Okay, she said finally. Okay? Okay? She picked up her backpack straps. But I'm bringing my art stuff. He stood up. His throat was doing something he didn't have time for. Yeah, bring your art stuff. He had her at the Westchester Safe House by 5. It was a house, a real one, not a facility. A normal-looking colonial on a quiet street with a kitchen and a backyard and a team of 2 that Reeves had hand-picked. A man named Torres and a woman named Park, both former military, both with the specific quality Mason looked for in people who were going to be around his daughter. They were competent without being aggressive, and they were kind without being condescending about it. Park helped Lily carry her art bag upstairs, and Lily, with the adaptability that children sometimes had and adults lost, had found the room she liked and was already asking if she could put things on the desk by the window. Torres walked Mason to the car. 24-hour coverage, Torres said. If anything changes in the threat picture, you'll hear from me before Reeves. That's a promise. She's going to ask questions, Mason said. She's smart and she reads adults. Don't lie to her. Just redirect. She handles redirection better than lies. Torres nodded. There was a quietness to him that Mason recognized, the settled quality of someone who had been in difficult places and come through them without losing the parts of themselves worth keeping. She'll be fine, Torres said. Mason nodded. He believed it, mostly. The part of him that was still a father rather than an operative believed it somewhat less. But that part had learned to operate alongside the fear rather than waiting for it to stop. He drove back toward the city as the October dark came down. Tut. By the time he got back to Manhattan, it was past 7, and Evelyn was still in the building. He knew this because Torres had patched him into a loose coordination with Reeves's monitoring of the building, and the feed showed her still in her office on the 38th floor, which struck him as both predictable and slightly reckless, given what the last 24 hours had contained. He went up through the service entrance and called her from the stairwell. Go home, he said when she answered. I have 3 earnings calls tomorrow and a board presentation. I understand. Go home tonight and do the prep from there. The building isn't where you want to be after 8 p.m. with a skeleton security crew. A pause. He could hear the particular silence of a person who was used to making their own decisions being told to make a different one and not loving it. "You're not actually employed by me," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not. So technically, I'm the guy who talked you through an ambush yesterday morning and is telling you right now that staying in this building late tonight is a bad idea, given the surveillance gaps I've already mapped." He kept his voice flat. "But you make your own call." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll be downstairs in 10 minutes, she said, and hung up. He waited in the lobby, standing near the side wall in the shadow of one of the structural columns, old habit, until she came off the elevator with her bag over one shoulder and her coat on her arm, and the specific expression of a person who had made a concession and was still deciding how she felt about it. Kowalski's team had a car outside. Mason walked her to it. On the sidewalk, in the cold air, she turned and looked at him. "Cho had a call today," she said. "A long one. His door was closed." "I know," Mason said. "I heard part of it." Something shifted in her expression. "You were on the floor. Near it." She looked at him for a moment in the way she'd been looking at him since the lobby, the assessing, recategorizing look. He was still not what she'd expected, he could tell. He still didn't know exactly what she'd expected, but whatever it was, he wasn't it, and she was still working out what to do with the gap between the two. "What did you hear?" she said. He told her the two phrases, watched her process them, watched the tightening around her eyes, the slight forward pull of her shoulders, the expression of a person fitting a piece into a picture they'd been building and finding it worse than they'd hoped. "The timeline has moved up," she repeated, meaning they're going to try again. "Meaning something is going to happen faster than originally planned," Mason said. "Whether that's another attempt on you or something related to the algorithm directly, I don't know yet." She was quiet for a moment. Kowalski's driver had the car running. Exhaust drifted in the cold air. "She doesn't know what she's actually sitting on," Evelyn said, half to herself. "That was the second one." "Yeah." "What does that mean? I've reviewed every technical brief Quillon has produced. I know the algorithm's capabilities." "Maybe not all of them," Mason said. She looked at him sharply. "Cho would have had to suppress information in official reports. That would mean he's been running a parallel track on this project for months. Maybe longer." "That's what I think, yes." The sharpness in her eyes shifted into something that was partly fury and partly something else. The particular hurt of a person who ran things on the assumption that the people they'd chosen to trust were trustworthy, and had just had that assumption broken in a very specific, very personal way. He didn't try to minimize it. He'd learned a long time ago that minimizing this kind of thing didn't help. It just made people feel more alone in it. "We need the full technical files," he said, "not the briefing documents, the raw research, the development logs, whatever Cho has been keeping off the official record." He paused. "Do you have access to those?" "I'm the CEO," she said. "That's not what I asked." A beat. "Theoretically, yes. In practice, the Quillon research environment is physically air-gapped. No external network connection. The full files are only accessible from terminals inside the lab on 31. She paused. "Which requires key card access that I have but haven't used in 8 months because Cho manages the day-to-day, and I trusted—" She stopped, exhaled. "Because I trusted him." "I know," Mason said. She pulled her coat on and looked at the street, the yellow cabs, the dark windows of the building across from Sterling Tower, the ordinary nighttime density of Midtown Manhattan moving around them without any awareness of what was happening in its middle. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm going to the lab. With you." "I'll be there," he said. She nodded and got in the car. The door closed. Mason watched the car pull out into traffic and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold, already calculating, already seeing the edges of what was coming. He thought about the phrase again. She doesn't know what she's actually sitting on. He thought about Lily at the desk by the window in Westchester with her art supplies spread around her, doing whatever she did when she was processing things she didn't have words for yet. Drawing, mostly, long, patient drawings of things she'd seen or imagined or felt, in colors that didn't always match what they were supposed to be, but always made a kind of sense. He turned up his collar against the October cold and went back to work. The sky above the city was the particular dark orange of a city that never went fully black. And somewhere above the 42nd floor of Sterling Tower, a man named Daniel Cho was either still in his office or already gone. And either way, the timeline was moving, and Mason Drake had a very short window in which the advantage of surprise still belonged to him. He intended to use it. They went to the lab at 6 in the morning before the building filled. Evelyn had cleared it with the overnight security log as a routine executive access. Nothing that would flag in Cho's daily briefings. Nothing that looked like what it was. Mason came in through the service entrance at 5:40, rode the freight elevator to 31, and was already in position near the lab's secondary access point when Evelyn stepped off the main elevator at 6:03 with her keycard and the careful, neutral expression of a person who had spent the night not sleeping and had decided to weaponize the exhaustion into focus. The lab was dark when they entered. Emergency lighting only. A low blue-green wash across the rows of workstations and server racks that turned the space into something colder and stranger than its daytime version. The air had the particular dryness of a temperature-controlled environment, and beneath the hum of the server cooling systems, there was a quality of silence that Mason associated with places where important things happened quietly. Evelyn went directly to the primary terminal at the center of the lab. Her hands on the keyboard were steady, which he respected. "Full access requires two-factor," she said quietly. "Keycard plus biometric." She pressed her thumb to the reader. The system thought about it for 3 seconds, long enough that Mason found himself watching the door, and then the screen unlocked. "Development logs first," Mason said. He was standing at the edge of the workstation cluster, watching both the lab entrance and the corridor visible through the glass partition. Anything Cho filed under the core algorithm project. "The project's called Cipher 9 internally," Evelyn said, navigating. He named it. A pause as she pulled up the file structure. There's a lot here, years of logs. Sort by recent modifications, anything touched in the last 3 months. She did. The list populated, and they both looked at it. The volume was wrong. Mason had reviewed enough intelligence files to know what legitimate R&D documentation looked like, and what he was seeing on the screen had a pattern that didn't fit normal development cadence. There were gaps, significant ones, in the official logs. Periods of 2 and 3 weeks where the recorded activity was minimal, flatlined, as if the project had stalled. But the server load data, visible in a secondary window, showed continuous heavy processing during those same periods. Someone had been running computations they weren't logging. "He's been keeping 2 sets of records," Evelyn said. Her voice was carefully level, the voice of a person describing something she was still processing. "The official project files, the ones I see in his briefings, and something else running parallel on the same hardware. Can you find the shadow files?" She was already looking. Her fingers moved through directory structures with the familiarity of someone who had spent years in the technical side of her industry before she'd moved into the executive track. And Mason filed that away. The fact that she knew this system, that she wasn't dependent on someone else to translate it for her. That was going to matter. "There," she said. A folder labeled with a string of numbers. No name, no project tag. She opened it, and the screen filled with documentation that was, even to Mason's non-technical reading of it, immediately and obviously different from the official files. Denser. More technical. And at the top of the most recent document, a date stamp from 48 hours ago. She read in silence for nearly 2 minutes. Mason watched the door and watched her face, and watched what happened to her face as she read, which was a controlled, progressive dismantling of something she'd believed. "He's been developing a second variant," she said finally. "What does that mean?" She sat back. "Cipher 9, as I understood it, as everyone at Quilon understood it, is a defensive tool. Encryption so strong it makes existing systems essentially unbreakable. That's the product. That's what we've been developing and what we've been pitching to government and enterprise clients." She paused. "What Cho has been building in parallel is the inverse. It's not a lock. It's a key." She turned to look at Mason. "A master key. Something that can break any encryption currently in use. Military, financial, intelligence, any of it, all of it." The server room hum felt louder suddenly. "He built a weapon," Mason said. "He built the most dangerous decryption tool in history, and filed it under a number string in a hidden directory while I was in board meetings approving his quarterly budgets. Her voice had gone to a place that was past anger, a flat, scorched place, for 18 months. Mason thought about the phone call in the ventilation shaft. She doesn't know what she's actually sitting on. He understood now what Cho had meant, and he understood why 4 men had walked into the lobby 2 days ago, and he understood with sudden, complete clarity that Evelyn Hayes had never been the actual prize. She was the door. The algorithm was what was behind it. "We need to copy these files," he said. "Mason, everything in that folder. We need a copy that exists somewhere other than this server before Cho realizes we've been in here." She was already reaching for a drive from the desk organizer beside the terminal when the lab's exterior access light went from green to red. Someone had badged into the outer corridor. Mason was moving before the light finished changing. He caught Evelyn's arm, pulled her away from the terminal without her having time to pull the drive, and moved them both behind the server rack row at the lab's far end in 4 steps. The rack was floor to ceiling, dense with hardware, and in the blue-green emergency lighting, the space behind it was dark enough to disappear into. He pressed her against the rack wall and put his finger to his lips, and she nodded, her breathing controlled but audible to him in the close space. The lab door opened, footsteps. One person, moving with the directional certainty of someone who knew the room. Mason tracked the sound. Main terminal area, which meant whoever it was had come for the same workstation Evelyn had just been at. The terminal that was still unlocked. He watched the faint reflection of the screen's glow change on the server rack casing as someone stood in front of it. A pause. Then the sound of typing. Then silence, which was worse. Then, "I know someone's been in here." Daniel Cho's voice, addressed to the room. Calm. Almost conversational. The biometric log shows an executive access at 6:03. There's only one executive whose biometric is registered for this lab. Evelyn's breathing shifted. Mason kept his hand on her arm. "You can come out," Cho said, "or you can stay back there and I can call up to Kowalski's team, and that conversation is going to go in directions neither of us wants." Mason considered the geometry of the situation. One exit, currently occupied. No weapons on him. Reeves's replacement piece was in the maintenance locker on the floor below. A decision that had seemed acceptable 6 hours ago and felt different now. Cho's positioning was at the terminal, which put him 30 feet from the server rack row with open floor between them. He stepped out from behind the rack. Cho turned. He was a compact man in his early 40s, sharply dressed in the way of someone who had learned that appearance was a form of argument. He had the face of a person who had prepared for this conversation and was disappointed it had come this way. His eyes went from Mason to Evelyn, who had stepped out a half-second behind. "Who are you?" he said to Mason. "Doesn't matter," Mason said. "It does to me." Cho's eyes were moving, assessing, calculating. Not panicked. That was the most telling thing. A man who discovered his CEO and an unknown person in his secured research lab in the dark at 6 in the morning, and he wasn't panicked. He was recalibrating. "You're not building security. You're not police." "Daniel," Evelyn's voice was extraordinary under the circumstances, hard and direct, with almost no tremor in it. "I read the Cipher 9 shadow files." Cho looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was not quite guilt and not quite relief. The expression of a person who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just had someone else acknowledge its weight. "How much did you read?" he said. "Enough." A beat. He looked at the terminal. "You didn't copy them?" "No," Mason said. "We didn't." Cho's jaw moved slightly. "You understand what you've stumbled into, both of you." He was still talking in that calm, slightly flattened voice that Mason found more alarming than shouting would have been. This isn't a corporate espionage situation. The people interested in this project, they're not going to stop because the lobby operation failed. They have other assets in play, multiple channels. "Who are they?" Mason said. "Which ones?" Cho said, with something that might have been bitter humor in a different context. "All of them." Cho looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down, slowly, in the workstation chair, and Mason watched a man who had been holding something together for a very long time begin to come apart in a controlled, deliberate way, like a structure being carefully deconstructed rather than collapsing. I developed the decryption variant 18 months ago, Cho said. I didn't plan to. It was a theoretical branch of the main project. I was testing the algorithm's boundaries, and I found that the same mathematical principles that made it unbreakable also made it a perfect master key for existing systems. He paused. I reported it internally, to one person, a board member I trusted, Marcus Webb. Mason went still. Marcus Webb. The name on the maintenance contractor credential Reeves had given him. Webb brought in outside parties, Cho continued. He told me they were government contacts, people who could help us monetize and protect the technology. I believed him for about 4 months. His hands were in his lap, very still. Then I started noticing things. The government contacts didn't behave like government contacts. The questions they asked were wrong. The level of secrecy they insisted on was wrong. He looked at Evelyn. I realized Webb had sold access to the project to a private broker, someone who was running an auction. An auction, Evelyn said. Multiple buyers. State intelligence services, private criminal networks, weapons brokers. Cho's voice was very flat. Whoever pays most gets the master key to every encrypted system on Earth. The server room hum filled the silence that followed that sentence. That's why they want me, Evelyn said. It wasn't quite a question. You're the only person whose legal authority over Quilon can transfer the intellectual property cleanly, Cho said. They don't just want the files, they need ownership that holds up to scrutiny. A coerced CEO signature on a technology transfer agreement. He paused. I tried to find a way to shut it down quietly, but Webb has leverage over me. I signed documents 18 months ago that I shouldn't have signed. If this goes public the way it is, I go down with it. So you leaked my schedule, Evelyn said. To buy time, Cho said. He met her eyes, and for the first time he looked like a man who was aware of exactly what he'd done. I thought if the operation succeeded, if they got what they needed, the auction would close and the exposure risk would be over. I didn't think anyone would get hurt. He stopped. I understand how that sounds. Mason looked at him. It sounds like a man who made a series of decisions that got progressively worse and is now sitting in a room explaining them to the person he put in danger. Cho had no answer for that. Where's Webb now? Mason said. He has a private yacht. The Meridian. It's moored in the Hudson at a private slip, Pier 66. He's been running the auction coordination from there for the last week. Cho paused. The closing bid is scheduled for Saturday. 3 days. Saturday. Mason did the math. 3 days to get ahead of an arms auction for the most dangerous decryption tool in existence, with buyers who included at minimum one state intelligence network and a criminal organization that had already demonstrated willingness to put armed operatives in a Manhattan lobby. I need the shadow files, he said. All of them. On a drive. Cho looked at the terminal. If I copy those files, Webb will know. The system flags external transfers. He has a monitoring feed. I know, Mason said. Do it anyway. Cho looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man being asked to step off a ledge he'd been standing on the edge of for 18 months, and then he turned to the terminal and started copying the files. They were out of the building by 7, not through the main lobby. Mason took them out through the freight entrance on the building's north side, into a service alley that put them on a cross street 2 blocks from Sterling Tower's front entrance. The October morning was gray and cold, the sky the flat white of incoming weather, and the street was in that particular early morning state of the city where the night shift was ending and the day shift hadn't fully arrived. Reeves met them in a parked car on the corner of 48th. Mason got in the back with Evelyn. Reeves was in the passenger seat, turned to face them, and he looked at the drive in Mason's hand and then at their faces, and he said, "Tell me." Mason told him. It took 6 minutes. When he finished, Reeves sat with it for a moment in the specific way that Reeves processed things, completely still, his eyes slightly unfocused, running the implications. Webb is running an auction, Reeves said, closing Saturday. The buyers, if they include state intelligence services, this isn't just a criminal matter anymore. This is a geopolitical incident waiting to happen. He paused. If any one entity gets sole possession of a master decryption key for current global encryption, I know, Mason said. The military implications alone. I know, Reeves. Reeves looked at him. We need to bring in the primary agencies. We can't, Mason said. Cho said Webb has assets in multiple channels. If we run this through official infrastructure, Webb finds out before we can move. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Evelyn was looking out the window at the gray morning, and Mason could see her reflection in the glass, pale, still, the expression of a person who was on the far side of something she couldn't go back from. Then we have 3 days, Reeves said finally, to get ahead of this before Saturday. Yes, Mason said. And the yacht. Yes. Reeves exhaled through his nose. Pier 66. That's what Cho said. We'll need to verify it. Reeves turned back to the front. I'll have eyes on it within the hour. The sniper found them at 10:45. Mason had taken Evelyn to a safe location, a mid-range hotel in Midtown under a cover identity Reeves maintained for operational use, while Reeves worked verification on the yacht and tried to build a picture of Webb's network. Mason had spent 3 hours reviewing the files from the drive on a laptop Reeves had provided, running through Cho's shadow documentation with the specific patience he'd developed for technical intelligence, not understanding all of it, but understanding enough to see the shape of it, the scale of what Cho had built, and what it would mean in the wrong hands. He'd been in the hotel room for 3 hours when his instincts, which had been quiet, went loud. It was a stillness thing. The way the foot traffic on the street below the window had changed. A specific absence at one point on the sidewalk that didn't match the natural pattern of pedestrian movement. He was at the window for 2 seconds before he registered what he was seeing, and then he was moving, catching Evelyn by the arm and pulling her sideways off the chair she'd been sitting in. The window cracked. A small, precise impact that put a star fracture in the upper right corner of the glass and buried a round in the plaster of the far wall at head height. They were on the floor. Evelyn's coffee cup was on its side on the carpet, spreading a dark stain. Don't move toward the window, Mason said. He was already calculating angle of entry, trajectory, likely position. The round had come in at a slight downward angle, which put the shooter elevated and across the street, which meant a building rather than street level, which meant this was planned rather than reactive. They followed us, Evelyn said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was on her hands and knees on the carpet, and she was looking at the coffee stain with the slightly dislocated focus of someone whose body was running on adrenaline. Or they had the safe location already compromised. Mason pulled his phone and called Reeves. We've got a shooter elevated across the street from the hotel. We're mobile in 2 minutes. I'm 6 blocks out, Reeves said. Go to the service exit, north side. I'll meet you. They'll have the service exit. Mason was already pulling Evelyn to her feet. Where's the nearest parking structure? West side of the block, 48th between 7th and 8th. Meet me at the second level. He got them out through the hotel's interior. Not the lobby, not the service exit, through the restaurant connected to the ground floor, through the kitchen, where 2 prep cooks stared at them with the alarmed expressions of people watching something that wasn't their problem. Move through their space and out through the kitchen's own delivery access that opened onto a different street from the hotel's main entrance. Running, not sprinting, controlled movement, staying close to the building line, using the mass of the morning crowd as cover. Evelyn kept pace without being told to. She was in heels, which was not ideal, and she lost 3 inches of height advantage, but she didn't stumble, and she didn't slow him down, and he noted both of those things. They made the parking structure in 4 minutes. Reeves was on the second level with a car he'd pulled from somewhere, engine running. Mason got Evelyn in the back, got in beside her, and Reeves was moving before the door fully closed. 1 shooter or more, Reeves said. At least 1 position shooter, Mason said. Probably a spotter. Could be a larger containment. I didn't have time to assess the full perimeter. They hit the location fast. That's either a tail from this morning or a compromised asset. Mason thought about Cho, who was still in the building, who had a monitoring feed, who had been making decisions for 18 months based on a cost-benefit analysis that hadn't worked out the way he'd planned. Maybe both, he said. Evelyn was looking at her hands in her lap. They shot at us, she said, not disbelieving, more like hearing herself say it out loud to make it real. Warning shot, Mason said. If they wanted you dead, you'd be dead. That was designed to flush us out, force us to move, see who our support network is, track where we go. So they're watching us right now. Probably. He looked out the rear window. The street behind them was normal traffic, but normal traffic could contain anything. Reeves, change of route. Don't go where you were planning to go. Already changed it, Reeves said. They drove for 40 minutes, Reeves running counter-surveillance patterns through Midtown and then down through the west side until he was satisfied. And then he pulled into a private garage in the 20s that Mason hadn't known existed, but filed away as another piece of Reeves's infrastructure. Inside the garage there was a second car, already loaded with equipment cases. "Tell me about the yacht," Mason said. "It's there," Reeves said, pulling up a satellite image on a tablet. "Moored at Pier 66, private slip, registered to a holding company that takes 4 steps to connect to web. 2 visible security personnel on deck. The boat is 72 feet, big enough to have onboard communications infrastructure, which is consistent with running an auction coordination operation." He paused. "Here's the problem. The auction closing is Saturday. Today is Wednesday. We have 3 days, but the window for effective intervention is probably narrower than that. Buyers at this level will want confirmation of acquisition before they commit final payment, which means Webb needs to have the product in hand by Friday at the latest." "Which means we have until Friday," Evelyn said. She'd been sitting on one of the equipment cases listening, and she'd taken her heels off at some point. She was in her stocking feet on the concrete floor of the garage, which struck Mason as both practical and somehow very human. "We need to get on that boat," Mason said. "With what resources?" Reeves said. "I can get us close. I can get us equipment. But getting aboard a secured private yacht with a likely armed security presence and whatever else Webb has in place, that's not a small operation." "What about Cho?" Evelyn said. They both looked at her. "He wants out," she said. "He told us that in the lab, even if he didn't say it directly. He's been trapped in this for 18 months, and he's looking for a way to extract himself without going to prison." She looked at Mason. "He knows Webb's operation. He knows the boat's security layout, probably. He knows the timeline and the buyer communication protocols." She paused. "He's an asset if we use him right." Mason considered this. She was right, which he didn't love because Cho had leaked her schedule and had been running a hidden weapons program in her company and had generally demonstrated a willingness to make bad decisions under pressure. Those were not qualities you wanted in an asset. But she was right. "I'll call him," Reeves said. Cho met them at the garage at 2 in the afternoon. He looked worse than he had that morning. The careful composure of 6 a.m. had been replaced by the expression of a man who had spent the intervening hours understanding the full scope of what was in motion. He'd brought a laptop, which he opened on the hood of Reeves's car without being asked, and pulled up a schematic that Mason recognized as deck plans. "The Meridian," Cho said. 72 feet, 2 decks. Webb operates from the main salon on the upper deck. He has a communications array up there that he's been using for the auction coordination. Satellite uplink, encrypted. He pointed. Security is 3 people, not 2. There's a third person below decks who rotates up on 4-hour cycles. They're professional, but they're not military." "Weapons?" Mason said. "Sidearms on the visible security. Webb himself has, I don't know exactly, but he's had the boat since the auction planning began, and he's been careful." He paused. "There's also a code for the communications array. If you can get to the terminal and enter it, you can access the full auction record. Buyer identities, transaction records, the technical files Webb received from me." He met Mason's eyes. "Everything you'd need to expose the entire network." "What's the code?" Cho told him. Mason repeated it once in his head until it was in the part of his memory that didn't lose things. "There's something else," Cho said. He looked at Evelyn. "The buyers. At least one of them. I saw a communication 3 days ago that I didn't fully understand at the time. One of the state intelligence interests isn't just a buyer. They have an asset inside the operation. Someone close to Webb who's been feeding them real-time updates." "Another double," Mason said. "Whoever it is, they've been ensuring that no other buyer gets ahead of them. If you go to the boat, you won't just be dealing with Webb's security. You'll be dealing with whatever that intelligence service has positioned." The garage was quiet for a moment. "We go tonight," Mason said. "Not Friday, not Thursday. Tonight. While they still think we're running." Reeves looked at him. "That's fast." Fast is better than organized in this case. Mason looked at the deck plans. If they have a state intelligence asset close to Webb, every hour we wait is an hour for that asset to get updated on our position and our resources. He looked at Cho. You're coming with us. Cho blinked. I'm not a field operative. I know, Mason said. You're coming because you know the boat and I don't. You can stay on the perimeter, but you're coming. Cho looked at the deck plans on his laptop screen. He looked like a man doing a very fast internal accounting of all his options and not being satisfied with any of them. Okay, he said. They went at 10 p.m. Reeves had a rigid inflatable boat, compact, low profile, the kind of thing that sat low in the water and didn't announce itself. He brought it to a private water access point 2 piers north of 66 that he'd apparently been using for exactly this kind of situation for a period of time Mason decided not to ask about. The Hudson was cold and choppy, the October wind coming off the water in gusts that tasted like metal and salt. The lights of New Jersey reflected across the river in broken lines. The Meridian was visible at Pier 66, a long, dark shape with a few lights burning on the upper deck, and the soft blue glow of electronics visible through the salon windows. One visible security figure on the rear deck. Mason went in the water at 40 meters out. He didn't give himself time to think about the temperature. He registered it, filed it, and moved. He'd swum in worse. The SEAL in him had developed a particular relationship with cold water over 11 years, something that wasn't exactly comfortable but wasn't fear either, just information. He reached the yacht's swim platform in 90 seconds and was aboard in 3 more. The rear deck security was facing the pier side, which was the intuitive thing to do. You watched the approach from land, not from water. That was a gap that most civilian security operations had, and Mason used it completely, coming over the transom rail low and quiet and solving the problem of the security guard with a chokehold that put the man on the deck in 11 seconds and out of the conversation for the next several minutes. He used the guard's radio to key twice, the signal for Reeves that the rear deck was clear. Reeves brought the inflatable alongside and Evelyn came aboard, and then Cho, who made considerably more noise than either of them and breathed like a man who did not spend time on boats. Mason put them in a covered position behind the deck equipment and went forward. The second security guard was on the forward deck, smoking, facing the bow. Mason came along the port rail and handled it the same way. Controlled, clean, the man down, and zip-tied to a deck cleat before he'd had time to process what was happening. Third guard below. Mason went down the companionway and found him in the galley, making coffee, which was so ordinary that there was almost something sad about it. The man reached for a holstered weapon and Mason was already inside his reach, the weapon redirected, the man against the galley counter with his arm in a position that made further argument unprofessional. Sit down, Mason said quietly. I'm not here to hurt you. Sit down and stay quiet. The man sat. Mason took the weapon and the radio and went back up. The main salon was at the top of the companionway ladder, behind a closed door from which a thin line of light bled at the sill. Mason could hear faintly the sound of a keyboard and the occasional soft tone of incoming communications. He opened the door. Marcus Webb was at the communications array with his back to the door, which was either arrogance or inattention, and in this moment it didn't matter which. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, gray-haired, wearing a dark sweater and reading glasses that were pushed up on his forehead. The array in front of him was a genuine piece of professional communications infrastructure. 3 screens, a satellite uplink terminal, a row of encrypted radio equipment that would have been expensive and difficult to acquire outside of official channels. He heard the door and turned. Mason held up the handgun he'd taken from the third guard. Webb looked at the gun. Then he looked at Mason's face. Then he looked at the door behind Mason, where Evelyn Hayes had just stepped in, and where Daniel Cho had stepped in behind her, and whatever calculation Webb had been running stopped running. You're the janitor, Webb said, looking at Mason. There was something in his voice that was almost impressed, which Mason found irritating. Sit down, Mason said. Webb sat. Evelyn moved to the communications array. Her eyes went to the screens and Mason watched her read what was on them. The auction records, the buyer communications, the technical specifications for Cipher 9's decryption variant displayed in a transaction file that had Webb's authorization signature on it. The closing bid, she said. Her voice had that scorched flatness again. He's already accepted one. Mason looked at Webb. When does the transfer happen? Webb smiled. It was the smile of a man who had decided in the last 30 seconds on a particular strategy. There are people watching this operation, he said. Not just my security. Other interested parties who are monitoring for exactly this kind of interference. If I don't check in by midnight, they'll know. You're not going to check in, Mason said. Then they'll know. The state intelligence asset, Mason said. The one you've been dealing with. Where are they? Webb's smile didn't move, which was itself an answer. Evelyn had pulled the drive from her jacket, the same drive Cho had loaded the shadow files onto that morning, and she plugged it into the array's secondary port. What are you doing? Cho said. Cross-referencing, she said. The files on this drive against the buyer records on this system. If I can create a complete documentation package, the development history, the transaction records, the buyer identities, and get it to a trusted external source before Friday, the auction becomes worthless. She looked at Mason. If the records are already public, the technology loses its black market value. Nobody pays $1 billion for something that the whole world knows about and can trace. Mason thought about that. It was a different kind of destruction than he'd been planning. Not physical, not the kind he was trained for, but it had the right shape. How long? 20 minutes, she said. He looked at Webb. 20 minutes, he said to him. Then we're done. Webb looked back at him with the expression of a man deciding whether he had a play left. He was still deciding when the salon door opened from the outside, and a man neither Mason nor Reeves had accounted for came through it with a weapon already raised, and the very next 20 minutes became the most complicated of a very complicated day. The man who came through the salon door was not Webb's security. Mason understood that in the first half second, the way he moved, the way he held the weapon, the specific economy of someone trained to clear a room rather than guard a perimeter. He was medium height, mid-40s, with the kind of unremarkable face that was itself a professional asset. His weapon was a suppressed 9mm, and it was pointed at Mason with the steadiness of someone who had pointed weapons at people many times and stopped feeling anything particular about it. Behind him, a second figure filled the doorway. The state intelligence asset. Not one person. Two. Mason ran the geometry in the half second he had before the situation locked. Webb to his left, seated. Evelyn at the communications array to his right, the drive still in the port, the upload progress at some unknown percentage. Cho behind Evelyn, pressed against the array housing. Reeves was still on the exterior deck. Mason had left him watching the perimeter, and he was now the only variable that hadn't been neutralized. The first man spoke in accented English, Eastern European, consistent with what Reeves had said about the network. Step away from the console. He was talking to Evelyn. She didn't move. Mason watched her hands, which were still on the keyboard, and he watched the upload progress bar on the secondary screen, which was at 31%, and he made a calculation. We're going to need you to step away, the man said again, and this time there was a slight shift in his posture that meant the next version of the request was going to involve the weapon moving from Mason to Evelyn. I'm almost done, Evelyn said. The man's posture completed its shift. Mason moved. He went left first, toward Webb, not toward the shooter, which was the counterintuitive move and the one that worked because the shooter's eye naturally followed the direction of the threat rather than the direction of the movement. Mason's hand caught the back of Webb's chair, and he put Webb between himself and the weapon in the time it took the shooter to recalibrate, and in that gap he closed the distance by half. The second man in the doorway was moving into the room, angling toward Evelyn, and Cho did something that Mason would not have predicted. He stepped in front of Evelyn. Not smoothly, not with any particular skill. He just stepped in front of her and raised both hands and said loudly, "Stop!" And the second man's attention went to him for 2 seconds because the gesture was so unexpected and so plainly untactical that it created a beat of genuine confusion. 2 seconds was what Mason needed. He reached the first shooter with Webb still partially between them, and the close-quarter sequence that followed was ugly and fast and nothing like a training exercise. The suppressed weapon discharged once into the salon ceiling as Mason redirected the muzzle. The shooter was good. He recovered his grip faster than most people would have, got his elbow into Mason's ribs with enough force to compromise Mason's breathing for a moment, and tried to create space between them. Mason didn't let him create space. He stayed inside the reach where the gun was less useful than elbows and knees, and he worked the weapon wrist until he felt the grip break and the gun came free. He had the weapon. The second man had Cho by the collar and was looking at Mason now with the recalculated expression of someone deciding whether the hostage in his hand was worth anything. "Put it down," the second man said. Mason looked at Cho. Cho looked back at him with the expression of a man who had made a series of bad decisions over 18 months and was now facing the terminal consequence of them, and was, against all probability, standing his ground. "Don't," Mason said to the second man. "You're done here. The upload is running. Whatever you came to get, it's already out of reach. The upload can be stopped." "Not if I shoot the terminal," Mason said. "Which I will, if you don't let him go." The man looked at the terminal. At the upload bar, which was at 67% edit Mason, Webb, from his chair, said something in a language Mason didn't speak, clipped, directed at the two men. An instruction. The first man, the one Mason had disarmed, straightened and moved toward the door. The second man released Cho, who stumbled sideways into the array housing and caught himself. The two men left. The salon was quiet except for the hum of the communications equipment and Evelyn's breathing and the soft, continuous progress tone of the upload. Mason stood with the suppressed 9mm pointed at the door for 4 full seconds after they'd gone, because 4 seconds was the standard buffer between an apparent withdrawal and a return with a changed plan. Nothing came through the door. He lowered the weapon. "They're not gone," he said. "They pulled back because the upload is running and shooting up the console defeats their purpose. But they're on the boat or on the pier, and they're going to wait for an opportunity." "How long?" Evelyn said. She was looking at the upload bar, 79%. "As long as the upload takes," Mason said. He moved to the salon's porthole window and looked out at the pier side. The dock was quiet. Too quiet. The particular stillness of a space that had recently had people in it moving carefully. His radio clicked twice. "Reeves," from the exterior. The 2-click pattern meant contact, holding position, which meant Reeves had eyes on the two men and they were on the boat. Mason clicked back once. "Understood." "Webb," he said, turning. "The two men. Who are they reporting to?" Webb had been very quiet since the confrontation, which Mason found more interesting than if he'd been loud. He was watching the upload bar with the expression of a man watching something he'd spent a long time building come apart. "They're contracted through a foreign intelligence directorate," he said. "I don't know their full chain of command. I never wanted to know." "What was the arrangement? They get a cut of the sale?" "They get the technology itself. The sale proceeds go to the criminal network buyers. The intelligence directorate gets a separate copy under the table." Webb paused. "Everyone gets what they want." "Except the rest of the world," Evelyn said. Webb looked at her. He had the particular blankness of a man who had been operating so long in the space between legal and illegal that the distinction had lost most of its texture for him. "I'm a broker," he said. "I don't make policy." "You're a man who sold a weapon capable of breaking every secure system on Earth to people whose intentions you knew were not good," Evelyn said. Her voice was very even. "That's not brokerage, that's a choice." Webb looked at the upload bar. 91%. He didn't respond. The upload completed at 11:47 p.m. The package: Cho's shadow development files, the auction transaction records, the buyer communication logs, Webb's authorization signatures, went to 3 separate destinations simultaneously: a secure server maintained by Reeves's organization, a legal firm that Evelyn had called from the boat with 9 words that were apparently sufficient to put specific protocols in motion, and a journalist at a financial investigations publication whose number Evelyn had in her phone for reasons she didn't explain and Mason didn't ask about. When the upload confirmed, Evelyn pulled the drive and stood up from the console. She looked tired in a way that went past the physical. The kind of tired that came from spending 4 days running from and toward something at the same time. From finding out the people around her had been lying. From being in a hotel room when a window cracked and a round went into the plaster at head height. She stood very straight, which he'd come to understand was what she did when she was holding things together through will rather than ease. "It's done," Cho said. "The exposure package is distributed," Evelyn said. "The legal hold goes into effect at 9 a.m. Any transaction involving Quilon Systems' intellectual property is blocked pending investigation." She looked at Cho. which means the auction closes with nothing to sell. Webb's buyers aren't going to accept that quietly, Cho said. No, Mason said. They're not. He was still watching the door. The two-click signal from Reeves had gone quiet, which meant either the situation outside had stabilized or Reeves had moved. Both possibilities required verification. He clicked once on the radio. No response. That was a problem. He moved to the porthole again. The pier side was still quiet, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It had the heavy, pre-event stillness that Mason associated with a situation that was about to change shape. He counted the dock lights, read the shadows, and found the thing that was wrong. There were 3 people on the dock who hadn't been there 6 minutes ago. Not Webb's contracted intelligence men. Different people, heavier operational footprint, different positioning. They were spread in a pattern that wasn't designed to watch the boat. It was designed to control access to the pier. He turned from the porthole. We need to move, now. What's... Cho started. There are 3 additional people on the dock. Mason crossed to Evelyn and put the drive in her jacket pocket. Keep that on you. Whatever happens, keep it on you. He looked at Webb. You called them. I pressed a button, Webb said. His voice had regained some of its earlier composure, the composure of a man who had been waiting for his situation to improve and believed it just had. A dead man's signal, built into the console. If I don't cancel it every 90 minutes, it sends an alert to my secondary security contractor. He paused. I didn't cancel it. Mason looked at him for a moment. Then he looked around the salon. The communications array. The equipment. The screens that were now dark from the upload completion. Cho, he said. Can you destroy the array? Cho blinked. What? The communications equipment. The satellite uplink. The encrypted radio array. Can you make it non-functional? I'm a cryptographer, not a demolitions. Hard drive, Mason said. Physical destruction of the storage media. Smash it, all of it. Understanding arrived in Cho's expression. Even if Webb's secondary contractors got aboard, they'd find a destroyed communications infrastructure and no recoverable files. The auction records, the buyer identities. Without the original system, Webb had nothing to offer anyone. Cho picked up a metal equipment case from the floor and looked at the array. Make it quick, Mason said. He went out through the salon door onto the upper deck. Reeves was on the starboard side, pressed against the deck housing, his expression carrying the specific tightness of a man who had been managing a situation by himself for the last several minutes and was glad to see reinforcement. 3 on the dock, Mason said quietly. 4, Reeves said. 1 more came from the south end of the pier 30 seconds ago. And the 2 from inside, they came back out through the forward hatch. They're on the foredeck. 6. Against Mason with a borrowed 9mm, Reeves with whatever he was carrying, Evelyn with no weapons training, and Cho, who had just been given permission to hit expensive electronics with a metal case. Options, Reeves said. Water exit, Mason said. Same way we came in. They're controlling the dock, but the water side is open. They'll hear us go over. Probably. Mason looked at the stern. But once we're in the water, they can't follow without a boat, and the only boat here is this one. He paused. Can you get the inflatable around to the stern quietly? Reeves looked toward the water. If I go now, before they tighten the perimeter, maybe. He paused. You'll be on the boat alone. For about 4 minutes, Mason said. Can you do it in 4 minutes? Reeves looked at him with the expression of a man who had known Mason for a long time and had developed a complicated relationship with these kinds of questions. I'll try, he said. Don't try, Mason said. Do it. Reeves went over the rail and into the water with less noise than seemed possible for a man in his 50s, and Mason went back inside. From below decks, the sound of Cho's methodical destruction of expensive equipment was a series of impacts that were louder than ideal, but not as loud as Mason had feared. He found Evelyn in the salon doorway watching it. We're going over the stern in about 4 minutes, Mason told her. Into the water, then into Reeves's boat. She looked at her jacket, her shoes, the October Hudson. Okay, she said. It's going to be cold. I figured. Stay close to me and don't surface until we're clear of the hull. She nodded. From the foredeck, voices. The 2 intelligence contractors were moving toward the salon. Mason could hear them on the deck above, their footsteps marking position and direction. He had maybe 90 seconds before they reached the upper deck salon door. "Cho," he said. Cho straightened up from the wreckage of the communications array. He was breathing hard, and there was a cut on his right hand from something sharp, and he looked at Mason with the expression of a man who had not expected the evening to contain this much physical activity. "Can you swim?" Mason asked. "Yes," Cho said. "Good." The salon door handle moved. Mason put himself between the door and the other two and raised the 9mm and said to whoever was on the other side, "I'll give you one opportunity to back away from the door." He kept his voice level, not loud. The kind of level that had always communicated, in his experience, that the person speaking meant exactly what they said. A pause on the other side. Voices, low, in the Eastern European language from earlier. The door handle released. He was aware that the reprieve was temporary. They were calculating, and the calculation was going to conclude that 4 against 1 with numbers still on the pier side was a favorable equation. But temporary was what he needed. He backed Evelyn and Cho through the interior toward the stern companionway, keeping the 9mm up and his body between them and the salon door. The companionway ladder was steep. Evelyn went down first, then Cho, then Mason. The stern deck was open and dark, the Hudson cold-smelling and black beyond the transom rail. No Reeves yet. 3 minutes gone. The dock lights gave Mason enough visibility to see one of the security contractors on the dock move, not toward the boat, toward the pier cleat. They were thinking about lines. If they pulled the mooring lines, the boat would drift into the channel and the water exit became irrelevant. "Hey," Mason said. Loud enough to carry to the dock, quiet enough not to carry to the foredeck above. The contractor stopped, looked at him. "Don't touch the lines," Mason said. The man looked at the weapon in Mason's hand. At the distance between them, 25 feet, across water and dock. A difficult shot in the dark, not impossible. The man did his own geometry and held his position. From the water to the port side, a soft sound. The inflatable's hull against the swim platform. Reeves. 4 minutes, 11 seconds. Mason kept the 9mm on the dock contractor and said quietly over his shoulder, "Evelyn, Cho, go." He heard them go over the transom, the cold water, Cho's sharp intake of breath, Reeves pulling them aboard. He held the position for 5 more seconds, counting, watching the dock contractor, watching the salon light above him on the upper deck where the 2 intelligence men were still making their calculation. 5 seconds was enough. 5 seconds was the professional buffer that kept a withdrawal from becoming a rout. Then he went over the rail. The water was exactly as cold as October in the Hudson was supposed to be, which was very. He went under and came up alongside the inflatable, and Reeves had him by the collar and hauled him aboard with the unceremonious efficiency of a man who had done this before. The engine was already running, just above idle, enough to move. Reeves pushed the throttle and the inflatable came off the swim platform and out into the open water, and Mason lay on his back in the bottom of the boat, looking up at the New Jersey skyline, and breathed. Evelyn was next to him, soaked, arms wrapped around herself. Cho was at the bow in a sitting position that suggested he'd landed badly getting aboard. Reeves was at the tiller, watching the pier behind them. No pursuit. "They're not coming," Reeves said. "No secondary boat." Nobody said anything for a moment. "The array," Mason said to Cho. "You got everything?" "Everything I could reach." Cho's voice was unsteady from cold or adrenaline or both. "The primary storage, the uplink authentication hardware, the encrypted radio modules." He paused. "Webb is going to be very unhappy." "Webb is going to be in federal custody before he has time to be unhappy," Reeves said. "What about the intelligence contractors?" Evelyn said. "They'll withdraw," Mason said. "Without the array, without the files, without a functioning auction, there's no asset to protect. They came for the technology. The technology is distributed and documented and legally locked. There's nothing left to come for." He paused. "The ones who stay around are the ones who want to cover their tracks. The smart ones disappear." He sat up. His ribs ached where the shooter's elbow had caught him, and the cold water had turned the bruise on his forearm from dull to sharp. He was wet and cold, and his hands were shaking slightly with the adrenaline metabolizing out of his system, which was normal and happened even after 11 years of this kind of work. The body didn't stop having responses. You just got better at using them while they were happening. Evelyn was looking at the lights of the city as they moved away from the pier, Manhattan's skyline bright and indifferent above the black water. "It's over?" she said. "The auction is over," Mason said. "The exposure package is distributed. The legal hold is in place." He looked at her. "The fallout is just starting." She nodded. She knew what that meant. Her company, her technology division, her CTO who'd been running a shadow weapons program in her building for 18 months. The board presentations, the investor calls. The question of what she'd known and when she'd known it. The answer to that question was clear and verifiable. She'd known nothing, and the paper trail Cho had built would prove it. But knowing the answer was clear didn't make the process of proving it simple or painless. "You'll get through it," Mason said. She looked at him. In the darkness of the river, with her hair wet and her makeup gone and her jacket soaked through, she looked less like the magazine cover version of herself and more like a person. Someone who'd been through 4 hard days and was still upright at the end of them. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said. "But I've seen you handle the last 4 days, and that's a better data set than most." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The shape of it was there. They came ashore at Reeves's access point and walked to the car that Reeves had staged nearby. And the city moved around them with its usual absolute lack of interest in what had just happened on the river. Mason changed out of his wet jacket in the car, and Reeves ran the heat and nobody talked much, which was appropriate. At 2 a.m, Reeves pulled into an underground parking structure in Midtown and made phone calls that Mason wasn't part of. And 40 minutes later, 2 vehicles arrived that contained people Mason recognized from the federal agency that had sent representatives to the lobby aftermath 5 days earlier. The handoff of Webb was efficient and cold, the way federal handoffs always were. Paperwork, recordings, chain of custody. Webb went into a vehicle without looking at any of them. He'd been quiet since the salon, the particular quiet of a man who was already building the framework of his cooperation agreement. Cho sat in the corner of the parking structure with his cut hand wrapped in a strip of cloth Reeves had found somewhere, and he answered questions from the federal representatives with the careful, deliberate truthfulness of a man who understood that the quality of what he said right now was going to determine the shape of the next several years of his life. Mason listened to enough of it to satisfy himself that Cho was giving them everything, not the managed version, the actual version. And then he stopped listening. Evelyn was standing apart from the activity, near the wall, holding a coffee someone had produced from somewhere. She was wearing a dry jacket someone had found in one of the vehicles, too large for her, the sleeves covering her hands. And she was watching the federal agents process Cho with an expression that had moved past exhaustion into something quieter. Mason stood beside her. "The board is going to want a full briefing tomorrow," she said. "Probably. My general counsel is going to have 17 separate conversations with me before noon. Also probably. And the journalist I sent the exposure package to is going to publish by Friday, regardless of what anyone asks her to do." "That's actually what you want," Mason said. "I know." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "It is. It's exactly what I want. If it's public, it's unmanageable by anyone trying to contain it." She paused. I've spent 3 years building that company. I made a decision to trust Daniel Cho with the most important project we'd ever run, and he wasn't the person I thought he was. "He was, partly," Mason said. "He made bad decisions under pressure and compounded them badly. But tonight, on the boat, he stood in front of you." She was quiet for a moment. "I know." "That doesn't fix what he did," Mason said. "But it's part of who he is, too." She considered that. "You're more generous than I expected." "I'm not generous," Mason said. I've known people who were one thing in an easy situation and a different thing when it cost them something. That counts." She looked at him. The too large jacket, the wet hair drying in the underground air, the direct assessing look that he'd been seeing for 4 days and had come to understand was just her default mode. She looked at things the way he mapped spaces, methodically, because that was how her brain worked. "What happens to you now?" she said. He thought about Lily in Westchester, at the desk by the window, probably asleep by now with her art supplies spread around her in Torres and Park doing their quiet rounds downstairs. "I go get my daughter," he said. Evelyn nodded. Something in her expression shifted. The CEO, the threat target, the woman who'd been through 4 days of people trying to control her future, went away for a moment, and what was left was something more straightforward. "She's lucky," she said, "to have someone who reorganizes everything around her." "I don't know about lucky," Mason said. "She didn't pick me. She's just stuck with me." "That's not what I meant," Evelyn said. He looked at her. He understood what she meant. He didn't have a response for it that felt right, so he didn't make one. From across the parking structure, Reeves caught his eye and gave a small nod. The federal handoff was wrapping up. The immediate situation, Webb, Cho, the evidence chain, was in official hands now, which meant Mason's role in the operational part of this was effectively complete. The buyers who hadn't been identified yet were a problem for the agencies and their resources. The state intelligence contractors who'd been on the boat were a problem for people with diplomatic channels Mason didn't operate in. The exposure package was distributed, the legal hold was active, the auction was dead. His part was done. He found Reeves by the car. "I need the Westchester address." "I'll drive you," Reeves said. "I'll take the car. You have things to wrap up here." Reeves looked at him for a moment with the expression he sometimes had, the older man's look, the one that had seen enough of Mason's choices over the years to have opinions about them. Then he reached into his pocket and held out the key fob. Mason took it. "Mason," Reeves said. He stopped. "You said when this was done, you were done. I want you to know I heard that." Mason looked at him. Reeves was 61 years old and had been in intelligence work for 35 years, and he had the particular quality of a man who knew the distance between the things he intended and the things that happened. And he was looking at Mason now with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite respect, but was somewhere in the territory between them. "I know you heard it," Mason said. "I mean, I heard it as a real thing," Reeves said. "Not as something to manage around." "Okay," Mason said. "Okay," Reeves said. Mason walked to the car. He drove north out of the parking structure and onto the empty nighttime streets, through the city and up toward the bridge and the dark ribbon of the highway north, the heater running and his hands steady on the wheel, thinking about nothing in particular and everything in general, the way a person's mind moved when the adrenaline was finally fully gone. The clock on the dash read 3:08 a.m. In 4 hours, Lily would wake up and probably argue with Torres about whether cereal counted as a complete breakfast, and she would ask where he was, and he would walk through the door of that colonial house in Westchester, and she would look at him with those brown eyes, the ones that saw through things. And she would know that whatever had been wrong was less wrong now, not because he told her, but because she could simply tell. He drove north through the dark, and the city behind him went smaller in the rearview mirror, and the road ahead was straight and clear. He arrived at the Westchester safe house at 3:51 in the morning. The house was dark, except for a single light in the downstairs hallway, the kind of light you left on for someone you were expecting. And Torres was on the porch when Mason pulled into the driveway, which meant Torres had heard the car from inside and come out before Mason had to knock. That was the mark of a good protection detail. Mason appreciated it without saying so. "Quiet night," Torres said. "Here or there?" "Both after midnight." Torres looked at him. The wet hair, the borrowed dry jacket, the particular tiredness that Mason knew was visible on his face, whether he tried to manage it or not. "You okay?" "Yeah," Mason said. Torres nodded and stepped aside. He didn't ask for details, which was also the mark of a professional. You asked what you needed to ask, and you left the rest alone. Mason went inside. The house smelled like the particular mix of a space that had been lived in briefly, but genuinely. Someone's cooking from earlier, the faint chemical smell of art supplies, the baseline warmth of a house where people had been awake and moving. He stood in the hallway for a moment and just breathed it in, which he knew was a strange thing to do, but he did it anyway. He went upstairs. Lily's door was open 2 inches, the way she always left it. She'd never liked a fully closed door at night, which was a preference she'd had since she was 4, and he'd learned to accommodate without making a thing of it. He pushed it open the rest of the way and stood in the doorway and looked at her. She was asleep on her side, one arm under the pillow, the other stretched out toward the edge of the bed. The desk by the window had her art supplies on it, exactly as she'd arranged them when she arrived, organized in her particular system that looked chaotic to everyone else, but had an internal logic she could navigate in the dark. There was a drawing on the desk that he couldn't fully see from the doorway, just shapes and color. He watched her breathe for a while. He was aware standing there of the specific quality of what he felt. Not relief exactly, or not just relief. Something more complicated than that. The last 4 days had contained a very clear illustration of what the world was willing to do to get what it wanted, and what was sleeping in front of him was the reason that illustration mattered to him at a level that no briefing or intelligence assessment ever could. She was 7 years old, and she had paint on her hands even when she was asleep, and she was the entire point of everything. He pulled the door back to its 2-inch position and went down the hall to the room Torres had set aside for him, and he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, which was its own kind of rest. He was asleep before he'd consciously decided to lie down. Lily woke him at 7:14 by opening the door and standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had information and was deciding how to deploy it. He was awake in the way he always woke, fast, fully, all at once, and for a half second the room was wrong, and then it wasn't. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She considered this. She was wearing the sweatshirt she slept in, the yellow one with the faded star on the front that had been through the wash too many times. Her hair was doing something complicated. "Park made eggs," she said. "Yeah?" "She puts cheese in them." A pause. "I told her you didn't like cheese and eggs." "I don't mind cheese and eggs." "I know, but I told her you didn't so I could get yours." He looked at her. "You ate my eggs." "They were going to get cold." He sat up. He ached in the specific places he'd expected to ache. Ribs, forearm, the back of his left shoulder from the swim. And his neck had done something interesting from sleeping in his jacket, but none of it was anything that mattered. "Go tell Park to make more eggs," he said. Lily unfolded her arms and went down the hall at speed, already calling to Park. And Mason sat on the edge of the bed in the Westchester safe house and felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 4 days. They stayed one more night at Reeves's recommendation. Not because the threat picture was still active. It wasn't, or at least the immediate operational threat wasn't, but because the exposure package publication was scheduled for Friday morning and Reeves wanted the news cycle to absorb the initial wave before Mason and Lily went back to their apartment in Queens. A precaution. Mason accepted it for what it was. He spent Thursday at the safe house with Lily. He hadn't done that in a long time. A full day, no partial attention, no part of his brain allocated to something else. They played cards, and she beat him at 3 rounds of Go Fish because she'd developed a method for tracking which cards he'd asked for and adjusting her strategy accordingly, which she explained to him afterward in detail with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a discovery. He listened to the whole explanation. In the afternoon, she showed him the drawing she'd done at the desk by the window. It was large. She'd taped 3 sheets of paper together. And it showed a building with glass walls, and inside the building, very small, a figure in gray. The figure had a mop. Outside the building, on all sides, were other figures that were less defined, more suggestion than portrait. And above the building, taking up nearly a third of the composition, was a sky rendered in an improbable mix of blue and orange that didn't match any sky he'd seen, but that made a kind of emotional sense. "Is that me?" he said, pointing at the figure with the mop. "Maybe," she said, in the tone of an artist declining to over-explain her work. "What's the sky doing?" "It's both things at once," she said, "day and night, because when you're inside a building, you don't always know which one it is outside." He looked at it for a long time. "That's really good, Lily," he said. She took the drawing back and looked at it herself, critically, the way she always assessed her own work. "The building's not quite right," she said. "The windows are too small." "The rest of it is right." She considered that. Then she rolled the drawing carefully and held it out to him. "You can have it," she said, "since you were in this building." He took it. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been insufficient. The story broke Friday morning. Mason read it on his phone while Lily was in the kitchen arguing good-naturedly with Torres about whether orange juice counted as a food group. The piece was in the Financial Investigations publication that Evelyn had sent the package to, and it was thorough in the way that good investigative journalism was thorough. Documented, sourced, specific. The headline named Quillon Systems, named the technology, named the auction. It named Marcus Webb. It didn't name Mason, which was how he'd wanted it. It named Daniel Cho. It named a board member of Hayes Capital Group, the one Cho had trusted 18 months ago with the discovery that had started all of this, and traced the chain of decisions that had led from that conversation to the yacht on the Hudson. It was not a flattering account of anyone involved, including people who deserved better and people who deserved worse. Evelyn Hayes was described accurately as the CEO who had been targeted by the operation and who had provided the evidence that exposed it. The piece quoted her directly. He could hear her voice in the quotes, the precise, controlled sentences of a person who had thought carefully about what she wanted to say and said exactly that. She didn't play victim, and she didn't perform outrage. She described what she'd found out and what she'd done about it, and what she intended to do going forward. He put the phone down and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the October trees had gone fully bare overnight, their branches against the gray sky doing something almost graphic, clean and dark and complicated. He thought about what she'd said on the boat. It's done? And what he'd said. The exposure package is distributed. He hadn't said yes, because he'd known then what he knew now. That done was a relative term. The auction was dead. Webb was in federal custody. Cho was cooperating. The technology was locked and documented and poisoned for anyone who tried to touch it quietly. The immediate danger was over. The rest of it, the investigation, the fallout, the international diplomatic noise that Reeves had told him was already beginning in channels he'd never see, that was going to run for a long time. That was the nature of things that involved state intelligence services and weapons brokers and nine-figure transactions. They had long tails. But Mason Drake was not going to be part of the tale. He decided that on the drive north at 3 a.m., and the decision had held through sleep and eggs and go fish and a drawing of a building with windows that were too small, and it was still holding now. They went home Saturday morning. The drive back to Queens was ordinary in the specific way that ordinary things were valuable after a week that had contained too much of the other kind. Lily fell asleep in the back seat before they reached the bridge, her head against the window, the rolled-up drawing in her lap. The city came into view across the water. The skyline, the density of it, the particular quality of morning light on a cloudy October Saturday that turned everything to silver and gray. He carried her upstairs when they got home, which she was technically too old for, and which she did not resist at all, and he put her on her bed and covered her and stood in the doorway of her room, her actual room, with her actual things, the drawings taped to the walls and the books stacked in the particular order she kept them. And he let himself have the feeling of being back in his own apartment with his daughter asleep in her own bed. He stood there longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went to the kitchen and made coffee and called Reeves. "You're home," Reeves said. "Yeah." "How's Lily?" "Asleep. She navigated the whole thing better than I did." "Kids are different," Reeves said. "They don't carry the analysis the way we do. They just feel it, and then it's over." Mason thought about that. He thought about the drawing, the gray figure with the mop, the improbable sky, the windows that were too small. "Maybe," he said. "The federal investigation is moving fast," Reeves said. Webb gave up 3 foreign contacts in the first 12 hours of formal interview. The State Intelligence Service is going to deny their operatives were involved, which everyone will know is theater, but it'll hold diplomatically. He paused. Cho's cooperation agreement is in process. His legal team is arguing diminished agency due to coercion. That's going to be contested. Probably takes a year to resolve. And the buyers who completed transactions before the auction closed? That's the longer problem, Reeves said. There were 2 partial transactions, not the full decryption variant, preliminary documentation only. The agencies are working to trace and recover. I won't tell you that's going to be clean or fast. No, Mason said. But the complete version, the actual working algorithm, is either in Evelyn's legal custody or destroyed. Cho's physical destruction of the array on the yacht eliminated the last operational copy Webb held. He paused. The world is not going to know how close this came to going the other way. Mason thought about that, about how often that was true. How many things in the world had come close to going a different way, in rooms and on boats, and in lobbies and in service shafts. and the world had continued in its ordinary course without any awareness of the distance between what happened and what almost happened. The janitor version of the story, he said. Sorry? Nobody sees the janitor, Mason said. Even after. Reeves was quiet for a moment. You did the right thing, he said. I know that's not a particularly sophisticated thing to say. It's true, though, Mason said. Yes, Reeves said. It is. Chuck. Evelyn called him the following Tuesday. He was at the park with Lily. She was on the climbing structure doing something ambitious with the upper bars that he was trying not to watch too closely. And his phone buzzed, and her name was on the screen, which still felt slightly strange because 5 days ago he hadn't known her name. Hayes, he said. A brief pause, then something that might have been a small laugh. You answered like I was a colleague. You are, kind of. Kind of, she agreed. How are you? Fine, he said. How's the board? Furious. She said it with the equanimity of a person who had expected exactly this and had decided to treat it as weather. There are 2 shareholders talking about a vote of confidence. My general counsel has been in my office 6 times this week. The technology division is in administrative hold pending review. A pause. It's everything I expected, and it's still exhausting. Will you get through it? Yes, she said, and the certainty in her voice was different from false confidence. It was the certainty of a person who had assessed the situation honestly and arrived at a conclusion. It's going to take a year, probably, but I have the documentation, I have the cooperation of the federal investigation, and I have the fact that everything that happened demonstrates clearly that I was the target, not the source. She paused. Cho's cooperation is helping. He's been accurate about the timeline and the board members' involvement. The story is verifiable. Good. The board member resigned this morning. She said it without particular satisfaction, which he noticed. Webb's assets are being frozen. There are civil suits already forming. It's going to be very loud for a while. Loud is manageable, Mason said. Yes. A pause that had a different quality. I wanted to call to say, I'm aware that what you did was more than a job. You could have left after the lobby. The undercover assignment was effectively over. You stayed because Lily was in danger and because... She stopped. I don't know exactly why. I think there are multiple reasons. There are, he said. I wanted to acknowledge that, she said. Not formally, just... I wanted you to know I understand it wasn't simple. He watched Lily reach the top bar and hang there for a moment with a look of pure focused satisfaction on her face before swinging to the next one. It wasn't, he said, but it's done now. Yes, she said. It is. There was a comfortable pause, the kind that happened between people who had been through something real together and didn't need to fill the space with noise. Your daughter, Evelyn said. Is she okay? She's on a climbing structure doing something that's making my heart rate go up, he said. So yeah, she's fine. He heard the smile in her voice. Good, she said. That's good. Take care of yourself, Hayes, he said. You too, Drake, she said and hung up. He put his phone in his pocket and watched Lily navigate the upper structure with the particular focused determination she brought to physical challenges. Her tongue slightly out the way it went when she was concentrating, her grip careful and her movements considered. She was not reckless. She never had been. She was someone who assessed what was in front of her and then committed to it, which was, Mason sometimes thought, the best version of how to move through the world. She reached the far platform and turned and found him with her eyes and grinned. The gap-toothed grin, the new tooth still coming in at its slight angle, and raised one hand in a wave that was mostly triumph. He raised his hand back. In the weeks that followed, the world reassembled itself around new information the way it always did. With partial attention and imperfect understanding, the full picture diffused across news cycles and official statements and the kind of background institutional noise that served as the cover story for things that had actually happened. The financial press covered the Quilon Systems story as a corporate governance failure, which was partly true and mostly insufficient. The national securities press covered it as a technology espionage case, which was also partly true. A few publications connected enough dots to describe something close to what had actually happened, And those pieces were read by the people who read that kind of thing and filed in the same mental space where people kept information that was real and uncomfortable and resistant to simple conclusions. Marcus Webb was indicted on 6 federal counts, including technology theft, weapons brokerage, and conspiracy. His attorney argued that the charges were overstated. The federal prosecutors disagreed. The case was expected to take 2 years to reach trial, and in the meantime, Webb sat in a facility that Mason never thought about because it wasn't his part of the story anymore. Daniel Cho's cooperation agreement was formalized in November. He received a reduced charge, 1 count of conspiracy, deferred prosecution, in exchange for complete cooperation with the federal investigation and his testimony against Webb and the board member whose name appeared in the indictment as co-conspirator A. He lost his position at Hayes Capital Group. He lost the reputation he'd built in cryptography over 15 years. He kept his freedom, conditionally, which was more than some people in his position got, and less than what he'd had before he made the first bad decision 18 months earlier. Mason heard about this through Reeves, not through the news. He filed it and moved on. The state intelligence service whose contractors had been on the yacht issued a formal denial of any involvement in the operation, which was received with the appropriate diplomatic response of no one believing it and everyone pretending to. 2 of the contractors disappeared into the bureaucratic fog that closed over intelligence operatives when their operations went wrong. A third was quietly expelled from the country under a different set of charges that bore no surface resemblance to what had actually happened. The diplomatic record would show a routine expulsion. The operational record, wherever it was classified, would show something different. None of this would ever be fully public. That was the nature of it. The complete story lived in files that most people would never read, and the incomplete version lived in the news cycle for 3 weeks before other things arrived to take its place. Mason understood this. He'd always understood it. The invisible work was invisible partly by design and partly by the simple arithmetic of what the world could hold in its attention at any given time. It had never bothered him the way it bothered some people. He hadn't done it for visibility. He'd done it because there was a gap between what was happening and what should be allowed to happen, and he was someone who could stand in that gap. November came and the city changed. The October gray gave way to something colder and cleaner, the streets carrying the particular bite of early winter that was different from fall, sharper, more honest about what it was. Lily's school had a parent-teacher conference, and her teacher, Mrs. Garibaldi, told Mason that Lily was reading 2 grades ahead and doing something interesting in art class that was technically outside the curriculum, but that the art teacher had decided to allow because the work was genuinely good. He sat in the small chair across from Mrs. Garibaldi's desk and listened to her talk about his daughter and felt the particular pride that was also a kind of grief, the pride in who Lily was becoming and the grief of what she was becoming it without. He didn't talk about that with Mrs. Garibaldi. He thanked her for the update and walked out into the hallway where the children's artwork covered the walls in the loud, confident way of 7-year-old artists who hadn't learned yet to doubt themselves. He found Lily's piece on the 3rd grade hallway wall. It was a new one, different from the drawing she'd given him. This one showed a park with a climbing structure and 2 figures, one large and one small, with their arms raised in a way that could have been greeting or celebration or both. The windows, in this one, were exactly the right size. Chug. He ran into Reeves once more, in December, at a coffee place near Penn Station where Reeves sometimes liked to meet because it was loud enough that conversations disappeared into the noise. Reeves was older looking than he'd been a month ago, which was the way with people who carried sustained stress. It arrived in aggregate rather than incrementally, as if the body held the cost in suspension and then deposited it all at once. They talked about small things first. The weather. A mutual acquaintance who had recently retired to somewhere coastal and seemed, against probability, happy about it. Then Reeves set down his coffee cup and looked at Mason with the direct look he used when he was going to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "There's a situation developing," he said, "in the Pacific. I'm not going to tell you about it." Mason looked at him. "I'm telling you I'm not going to tell you about it," Reeves said, "because in the past, the way these conversations have gone is I've told you and you've listened and then you've made a decision I could have predicted in advance." He picked up his coffee cup. "So I'm trying a different approach." "What's the different approach?" "Telling you there's a thing and then not telling you the thing. Reeves drank his coffee. Seeing if that's sufficient. It isn't, Mason said. I know, until Reeves set the cup down. But your daughter is 8 in February, and she's reading 2 grades ahead, and she has your eyes, Mason. She has your eyes and her mother's way of looking at things, and she is going to be a person that neither of us can fully imagine yet. He paused. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. Mason sat with that. I know, he said. So when the next thing comes, and it will come, it always comes, I'm asking you to remember that I said that, before you decide. You're asking me in advance. I'm asking you in advance, Reeves said, because in the moment, you're going to make the argument that it's necessary, and you're going to be right, and I'm going to let you, and that's the pattern. He met Mason's eyes. I don't want to be part of that pattern anymore. Not with you. Mason was quiet for a while. Outside the coffee place, the December street moved past the window. People in coats, the steam of breath in cold air, the ordinary density of a city afternoon. Okay, he said. Reeves looked at him. Okay, what? Okay, I hear you, Mason said. That's what I've got. Reeves seemed to weigh this, decided it was enough for now, and nodded. They finished their coffee. The thing about invisible work was that its value was entirely in what it prevented. You could not point to the thing that didn't happen and explain its weight. You could not show someone the auction that didn't close, the weapon that wasn't sold, the systems that weren't broken open. The absence of the disaster was itself the whole result, and absence was the hardest thing to make legible. Mason had thought about this, off and on, for 11 years. He'd thought about it more in the 4 years since he'd stopped doing it formally, and he'd come to a conclusion that he couldn't have arrived at when he was younger, which was this. The invisibility was not a cost. It was the point. The janitor was invisible because the janitor was supposed to be invisible. The work lived in the gap between what was visible and what was real, and you either made your peace with that gap or you found a different kind of work. Mason had made his peace with it a long time ago, or he'd thought he had. What the last few weeks had shown him was that peace with something was not a permanent state. You arrived at it, and then the circumstances changed, and you had to arrive at it again, differently, through a different route, because the person you were when you arrived the second time was not the same person who'd arrived the first time. He was 35 years old, and he had a daughter who could out-strategize him at Go Fish, and a forearm bruise that was finally, 3 weeks later, fully healed, and a rolled-up drawing in the kitchen drawer of a building with a figure in gray and an improbable sky. He had a 1-bedroom apartment that he'd converted into a 2-bedroom with a partition wall he'd built himself, imperfectly, the seams visible if you looked, holding together anyway. He had a contact in a federal agency who'd called him twice since the web case to ask questions he'd answered briefly and without elaboration. He had the specific, qualified piece of a man who had done a thing that needed doing and was still working out what came next. He didn't know what came next. He knew that Lily's birthday was in February, and she wanted a set of professional watercolor paints, the kind that came in a wooden box, which were expensive and which he'd already bought and hidden in the top of his closet. He knew that she had a loose tooth that she was monitoring with the intensity of a scientist tracking an experiment. He knew that she asked him sometimes, in the way of children who were working toward a question they hadn't fully formed yet, about her mother. Small questions, edge questions, the kind that were really about the larger question she was building the courage to ask directly. He was ready for that question. He'd been getting ready for it for 3 years, in the way you prepared for things that mattered, not by scripting a response, but by thinking about what was true, and how you said true things to someone you loved in a way that helped, rather than just informed. Her mother had been a woman who saw through things, who looked at a situation and found what was real in it rather than what was convenient. She'd been impatient and kind and sometimes wrong and always honest about being wrong. And she'd loved Mason in the specific, clear-eyed way of a person who knew exactly who she was loving and had decided it was worth the complication. She had died at 31 of something that had no reason to it, no logic, no narrative purpose, no lesson that made the cost acceptable. She had just died, the way people died, and the world had continued, and Mason had picked up Lily and kept walking. That was the story he would tell her when she was ready for it. Not the version that made sense of it, just the version that was true. On a Saturday in late December, Mason and Lily took the subway to Lower Manhattan and walked along the waterfront in the cold. It was Lily's idea. She'd been studying the city in the particular way she studied things she was interested in, methodically, from a book she'd gotten from the school library. And she had a list of things she wanted to see, and the waterfront was on the list because of something she'd read about the harbor. They walked along the promenade with the water on one side and the city on the other, and Lily pointed at things and explained them to him with the slightly professorial air she got when she'd done research, and he listened and asked questions that were partly genuine and partly designed to extend her pleasure in knowing things. At one point she stopped and looked out at the harbor, and was quiet for a while, which was unusual enough that he waited to see what came out of it. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah? Do you think anybody knows about all the stuff you do?" He looked at her. "What stuff?" "The stuff you do," she said, with the patience of a child who was not going to be redirected. "The work stuff. The real work stuff." He thought about how to answer that. He thought about Reeves in the coffee place, about Evelyn on the waterfront of a different body of water, in the dark, in a too large jacket, about Torres saying she'll be fine with the quiet conviction of someone who meant it, about 4 men on a marble floor and a wet floor sign, and the particular silence of a lobby after something impossible has just happened. "Some people know some of it," he said. She considered this. "But not everybody." "No, not everybody." She looked back out at the harbor. "Is that hard?" He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "Sometimes," he said. "Less than it used to be." She nodded, like that was an answer she could work with. They stood there for a while, the two of them, in the December cold with the harbor in front of them, and the city behind them, and the particular quality of winter light that made everything look both clean and temporary. A ferry moved across the water in the middle distance. Somewhere to the south, a siren started and then stopped. "I think it matters," Lily said, "even if nobody knows." He looked down at her. She was looking at the water, her chin slightly forward, her hands in her pockets, her gap-toothed mouth closed in a line that was more certain than uncertain. "Yeah?" he said. "Yeah," she said. "Because the thing happened or it didn't. Whether people know doesn't change which one." He stood with that for a moment. 7 years old. "You're right," he said. She looked up at him with the brown eyes that saw through things, and she smiled. Not the big triumphant grin from the climbing structure, something smaller and more private, the kind of smile that was just for the two of them. And then she pulled her hand out of her pocket and put it in his, and they turned and walked back along the waterfront toward the subway, toward home, toward the ordinary Saturday that was waiting for them with its small requirements and its specific warmth. The city moved around them. The harbor went about its business. The winter light did what winter light did. And Mason Drake, who had once been a Navy SEAL and was currently a father and would always be both in some proportion that shifted without warning, walked with his daughter through the cold December afternoon and felt, in the uncomplicated way that only certain moments allowed, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the world had been fixed, it hadn't. Not because the bad things had stopped existing, they hadn't. Not because the gap was closed, it never fully closed, and there would be another call from Reeves eventually, and another situation developing somewhere in the world, and another set of calculations to run. But because right now, in this moment, on this waterfront, his daughter's hand was in his, and she was talking about something she'd read about harbor navigation, and the ferry was still crossing the water, and the tooth was still loose, and the watercolor paints were still in the top of the closet waiting for February. The strongest people he'd ever known were not the ones who were unafraid. They were the ones who were afraid and kept moving anyway, toward the thing that mattered, through whatever was in the way. He'd spent 11 years thinking that applied to combat. He understood now, in a way that had taken him longer than it should have, that it applied equally to this, to the daily, unglamorous work of being present for someone who needed you to be present, to showing up at the school gate, to making eggs, to listening to everything, to being the person your child believed was coming, even when they couldn't see you yet. He was that person. That was enough. That was when you stripped everything else away and held what remained up to whatever light you had available, the only victory that had ever actually meant anything. He squeezed Lily's hand. She squeezed back. They went home.